Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to wander quietly through deep time. You've arrived at Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for the sleepless mind. Here, we don't shout about discoveries. We listen to them. We trace fossils like memories, follow genes like whispers, and watch the long patience of evolution unfold. One calm story at a time. Imagine this. A skull hidden in the darkness of a well, buried not by time, but by choice. In the year 1933, in the city of Harbin in northeast China, a bridge was being built over the Songhua River. The land was occupied by Japanese forces, and among the local workers was a man who, by accident or fate, unearthed an ancient human skull. He understood immediately that it was something extraordinary, something that should not fall into foreign hands. So he did something quietly heroic. He wrapped it in cloth, lowered it into an abandoned well, and left it there. For the rest of his life he told no one. Only near his death, decades later, did he whisper the secret to his family. That in an old well, under the weight of dust and memory, a piece of our deep past was waiting. When scientists finally retrieved it in the year 2018, the skull had survived 85 years in silence, and yet its story had survived even longer, almost 150,000 years before it was ever touched by human hands again. Its rediscovery would ripple through the field of human evolution, challenging one of the deepest assumptions we hold about ourselves, that the cradle of humankind was singular, confined, and simple. What emerged from that well was not just a fossil, but a riddle with a face. The skull came to be known as the Harbin cranium, or more poetically, the Dragon Man. It was massive, larger than any modern humans, with a brain volume on par with our own or slightly greater. Its brow ridges were thick, yet its face was surprisingly delicate, a combination of primitive and modern that refused to fit any known lineage. For a time, it was quietly catalogued as another archaic human specimen, a distant cousin perhaps, maybe an unusually large Homo erectus. But when scientists examined it more closely, they realized this was something else entirely. Radiometric dating placed its age somewhere between 146,000 and 309,000 years old, an almost absurdly wide window, but enough to suggest it belonged to a period of great complexity in human evolution. This was not the dawn of our species, nor the dusk of Neanderthals. It came from an overlapping world, one where multiple kinds of humans walked the earth together, trading genes, tools, and perhaps glances across the ice and plains. The researchers who studied it described features unlike any other known group. The eye sockets were large and nearly square. The cheekbones were flat, the nose broad, the jaw strong yet lacking the protruding chin of modern humans. It looked both ancient and startlingly human, as if evolution had drawn, erased, and redrawn the same face multiple times until it became familiar. Its discoverers proposed a new species, Homo longi, meaning the Dragon Man. Others hesitated, arguing it was simply another member of an already crowded branch, perhaps denisovan, perhaps something in between. But no one doubted its importance. To scientists like Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London, the Harbin skull offered more than morphology. It offered context. For decades, paleoanthropology had been guided by the idea that all truly human lineages originated in Africa and later expanded outward. But the Harbin find hinted at something more intricate, a possibility that the story of our shared ancestor, the mysterious Ancestor X, might have unfolded not in one continent, but across several. If true, the human family tree was less a trunk with branches and more a network of roots entangled beneath continents. When the first papers were published in 2021, headlines spoke of a new closest relative to modern humans, potentially closer even than Neanderthals. But in truth, scientists were cautious. The fossils alone could not reveal genetics, and no DNA had been recovered from the Harbin specimen. Still, its shape whispered familiar patterns, a face reminiscent of other Chinese fossils like Dali and Jinyoshan, but evolved further, larger, more sophisticated. The implication was that East Asia was not merely a remote theatre of human evolution, it was one of its main stages. The man who once lowered the skull into the well could not have known that he was also lowering a question into the future. Who were we before we called ourselves modern? And did the story of that becoming truly begin in one place? Or was it already scattered, long before we learned to map the world? The rediscovery of the Harbin skull rekindled that search, not for a species, but for connection. Every major fossil found before had carried an assumption with it, that evolution moved outward from Africa in a linear, almost narrative sequence. But this skull sat outside that line, defying the simplicity of the out-of-Africa model without erasing its truth. Africa, after all, remains the birthplace of Homo sapiens as we define them. Yet the Harbin skull suggested that before we emerged, the exchange between continents had already begun, migrations moving back and forth, blending and diverging over hundreds of thousands of years. For scientists, that realization is both thrilling and humbling. It reminds us how fragile our reconstructions are, how each new discovery forces us to redraw what we thought was settled. For every headline announcing certainty, there are 10 quiet corrections in lab notes. The Harbin skull, in its silence, made a louder correction than most. If you imagine holding it, you'd notice the sheer density, nearly a kilogram heavier than a modern skull. Its thick cranial vault suggests adaptation to cold climates, perhaps northern China during one of the Pleistocene's glacial pulses. Its large nasal cavity implies it breathed frigid air, but its brain size, around 1,400 cubic centimetres, shows a mind no less capable of abstraction than ours. This was not a brute, it was a thinker shaped by ice and wind, perhaps looking at the same moon we do and wondering what lay beyond the river. The challenge now is not how to name it, but where to place it. The boundaries between species in the genus Homo are fuzzy, made of both bone and imagination. Names like Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo antecessor attempt to capture transitions that were anything but clean. The Harbin skull sits uneasily among them, too advanced for erectus, too primitive for sapiens. It is, in a way, the fossil embodiment of the gap we call Ancestor X, the invisible node in our evolutionary web where Neanderthals, denisovans, and modern humans last converged. To reconstruct such relationships, scientists turn to both morphology and statistics. They measure dozens of traits: the curvature of the forehead, the angle of the mandible, the width of the palate, and feed them into computational models that test similarity. When the Harbin skull was run through such analyses, it clustered not with Neanderthals, but with specimens thought to represent early East Asian humans. This suggested that at least one branch of the family tree had been evolving in parallel to our own, possibly exchanging genes with us later. The world of 800,000 years ago may have been less isolated than we imagine. Continents linked not just by land bridges, but by shared ancestry. Every fossil carries bias, not the bias of opinion, but of preservation. Bones survive by accident. The Harbin skull endured because it fell into sediment near a riverbank, was covered, compacted, and sealed away before erosion could destroy it. Most of our ancestors' bones were not so lucky. That is why every discovery feels both monumental and misleading. A single page from a book whose rest has burned. The temptation is to read that page as the whole story. The wiser choice is to read it as evidence that there was a story at all. When researchers examined the skull's microstructure, they found dense cortical bone and signs of slow growth, a body adapted to long maturation, perhaps extended childhoods. That detail matters because extended juvenile periods are linked to learning and social complexity. If these humans raised their young longer, they may have shared something fundamental with us: patience, evolution, like parenting, rewards patience more than strength. It's easy to romanticize fossils, to imagine their owners staring into firelight pondering the same questions we do. But we should resist that comfort. The Harbin individual lived in a world we can barely reconstruct. Rivers shifting course, glaciers advancing and retreating, other hominins roaming nearby. Whether it belonged to a tribe that spoke, planned or mourned, we cannot say. What we can say is that it endured, long enough to leave behind a trace sturdy enough to find us again. In scientific terms, the Harbin skull opened what some call the Asian Renaissance in human origins research. For much of the 20th century, East Asian fossils were underrepresented in global debates. But technology, CT scanning, isotopic dating, digital reconstruction, has begun to level that imbalance. Now, skulls like Harbin's speak across languages and borders, forcing collaboration rather than competition. Each measurement taken from it echoes through international databases, recalibrating timelines from Spain to Siberia. There is a quiet irony in this. The skull was hidden during war, buried to avoid colonial possession, and now its rediscovery demands global cooperation. The very fossil that once symbolized division now unites laboratories from Beijing to London, sequencing data, comparing scans, translating ancient bone into shared understanding. In this way, the Harbin skull is not just a relic of evolution, it's a metaphor for science itself, fragile, rediscovered, and dependent on trust. Still, uncertainty persists. Some researchers question whether Homo longi deserves its own name at all. Without DNA, its placement will remain speculative. Others caution against inflating every anomaly into a species, warning that we may be naming moments in a continuum rather than distinct beings. They may all be right. Science is not about building monuments to certainty. It's about testing what survives collapse. What makes the Harbin skull unforgettable is that it reawakens humility. It reminds us that deep time is not a straight road leading to us, but a landscape littered with experiments. For every lineage that thrived, others vanished. For every adaptation that worked, countless failed. Yet in those failures lies meaning, the realization that survival is not proof of superiority, only of chance and change. If you could stand beside that well in 1933 and watch the man lower the skull into darkness, you might wonder what he felt. Fear, reverence, or simply a quiet instinct to protect something older than politics. Decades later, when his descendants pulled it back into light, the world had changed, but the questions had not. Who were we? Where did we come from? And how many versions of us had there been before this one? The Harbin skull does not answer those questions. It complicates them. But in doing so, it brings us closer to truth, not by filling the gaps, but by revealing how large they still are. Perhaps that is what makes it beautiful. It's a reminder that knowing less is sometimes the beginning of understanding more. For now, the skull rests in a museum in Shenyang, meticulously preserved, scanned, and studied. Its contours are rendered in three-dimensional models that can be rotated, measured, and shared across the world. And yet, no scan can reproduce the weight of holding it, the sense of time compressed into bone. To stand before it is to look at the outline of an ancestor who may have shared neither our language nor our name, but certainly our curiosity. We may never know if the Dragon Man was our cousin, our ancestor, or just another branch lost to the cold, but his survival and his rediscovery carry a simple truth. Even when buried for a lifetime, evidence finds its way back to daylight. It only waits for us to listen. If you find comfort in understanding how everything came to be, from ancient skulls to starlight, this is your space to breathe and learn slowly. If you'd like to help other restless thinkers find these stories, a simple like or subscribe is more powerful than you think. It keeps calm curiosity alive on a very loud internet. Tell me in the comments, do you listen before sleep while working, or drifting on headphones somewhere between both? And if you fade out mid-story, the timestamps are waiting for you when you return. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. What if I told you that your body still carries memories that are older than bones? Not the kind written in journals or etched in stone, but the quiet code inside every cell, an unbroken record of survival stretching back millions of years. If DNA remembers everything, why can't it remember the beginning? That is the paradox that modern genomics has been trying to solve. The deeper scientists look into the genome of our species, the more clearly they see the traces of others, and the more invisible the origin itself becomes. When the first fragments of ancient DNA were extracted from fossilized bones in the late 20th century, it seemed almost impossible that genetic material could survive for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet it did. In that molecular dust lay a hidden archive. Every mutation, every inheritance, every migration preserved in chemical silence. When computers finally learned to read those patterns, they revealed something extraordinary. Our lineage was not a single line, but a braided river of genomes branching and rejoining, shaped by encounters we never witnessed. Comparative genomics began as an attempt to measure distance, how far apart we were from our closest relatives. But distance was only half the story. By comparing DNA sequences from living humans with the genomes recovered from ancient bones, researchers could trace back the timing of splits, when populations diverged, when they met again, and when their genetic threads were woven into ours. These splits are not arbitrary dates, they are echoes of events that changed what it meant to be human. Somewhere in that data, scientists found a shadow, a population that should exist but doesn't appear in the fossil record. They began to call it, informally, the ghost lineage. Every genome is a kind of time machine. The mutations you carry right now did not appear at once but accumulated slowly, generation after generation, like stars forming in a night sky. By comparing how many mutations two species share, scientists can estimate when their last common ancestor lived. It's a technique known as molecular clock dating, and it works not by measuring years directly, but by counting genetic changes, assuming, roughly, that they accumulate at a predictable rate. Yet, as data grew, something strange happened. The timelines built from DNA did not always match those built from bones. The more genomes we sequenced, from modern humans, neanderthals, denisovans, and diverse living populations, the more tangled the story became. Instead of one clean divergence between archaic and modern humans, the data showed multiple phases of separation and reconnection. Lineages that split apart 500,000 years ago sometimes mixed again 200,000 years later. Others never fully separated at all. It was like listening to a choir where some voices never stopped harmonizing, even when they moved to different continents. The real breakthrough came when researchers began analyzing not entire genomes, but the statistical frequencies of certain genetic patterns. Small, repeated motifs that reveal how populations were structured in deep time. Using complex models, they simulated millions of possible evolutionary scenarios and tested which ones best matched the observed data. Out of that mathematical fog emerged a consistent signal. Before modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans went their separate ways. There must have been at least one other group, an ancestral population that contributed genes to all three, but left no direct descendants we can name. Its genetic fingerprints appear faintly across all branches, but never dominate any, as if it were the unseen root of a tree whose trunk vanished. This realization forced a quiet revolution in evolutionary genetics. It suggested that the story of humankind was not a simple lineage, but a mosaic, formed by small populations that kept splitting and merging under the pressures of climate and geography. Some survived, most did not. What we call Homo sapiens is simply one of those survivors, carrying within it fragments of many others. When scientists look for the beginning of our species in DNA, they do not find a single ancestor. They find a web of relationships gradually coalescing into something recognisably human. Ancient DNA also exposed how persistent genetic memory can be. Even after tens of thousands of generations, small fragments of archaic DNA remain in our genomes, passed down through countless births. Some of these genes help regulate our immune systems, others our metabolism, and some even our response to altitude or temperature. They are the living proof that ancestry is not a philosophical question, but a biological inheritance. Yet these fragments, precisely because they exist, also tell us what is missing. They speak of populations that once were, whose bones have not yet been found. To understand how these ghost lineages are detected, it helps to picture a branching tree of DNA sequences. If you compare modern human genomes with Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, you'll find most branches cluster where expected, Neanderthals closer to us than the denisovans, for example. But occasionally certain sequences fall outside the expected pattern, diverging too early or showing hybrid features. Those anomalies are clues. When enough of them accumulate, they form statistical evidence that an unknown population must have contributed genes to both lineages. That population is not visible in any fossil collection. It exists only in the data. Such patterns first appeared in studies of African genomes. When researchers analysed DNA from different African populations, they noticed that some segments were far more ancient than others. So ancient that they must have come from a lineage that diverged from the main human population nearly 1 million years ago. These segments were not random noise. They appeared in consistent regions of the genome, implying ancient interbreeding with a population that had long since vanished. This ghost lineage may represent a group of archaic humans that lived in Africa, alongside the ancestors of modern Homo sapiens, contributing a small but enduring genetic legacy. The same phenomenon appears outside Africa as well. In the genomes of some living people in Asia and Oceania, small percentages of DNA trace back to denisovans, and within that even older components hint at mixtures with populations older still. It's as if every generation carried forward fragments of history, unaware that they were walking archives. The deeper scientists look, the more ghosts they find, not spectral in the supernatural sense, but statistical, faint signals of real beings whose bodies are lost to time. Modern computing has made this possible. Each full human genome contains more than 3 billion base pairs, and when hundreds of genomes are compared simultaneously, the possible evolutionary trees number in the billions. Sophisticated algorithms now search this genomic forest for the most plausible routes of inheritance, like tracing the flow of a river back to its hidden source. But even the best models reach a horizon they cannot cross. Beyond roughly 1 million years, the signal fades. DNA decays. The molecular memory becomes static. That's where the beginning hides, just out of reach, erased not by ignorance but by chemistry itself. The most sobering part of this work is realising how little of our story we can ever recover. DNA tells us when populations met or parted, but it cannot tell us what they thought, how they lived, or whether they sang to their children at night. For that we must turn to archaeology, to the bones and tools that complement the genome statistics. Yet without genetics, we would never have known that so many lineages coexisted, invisible to the fossil record. In a way, molecular data gives voice to those whose skeletons have turned to dust. When ancient DNA was first extracted from a Neanderthal bone in the late 1990s, it seemed like an isolated achievement. 2 decades later, entire databases of ancient genomes exist, and they speak to one another. They show us that humans have always been mixed, that purity is a myth not only socially but biologically. We are, by every measure, a species built from collaboration, forced, accidental or otherwise. Each interbreeding event added diversity, resilience, and sometimes tragedy. The ghosts in our data are not ancestors to fear, but evidence of how evolution improvises. It is easy to assume that technology gives us mastery over the past. In truth, it only deepens the mystery. Every genome sequenced expands our ignorance faster than our understanding. Each new signal of a ghost lineage reminds us that the beginning is still hidden behind the fog of time. Perhaps it always will be. And maybe that is what keeps science alive, the realization that some questions are not meant to be closed but continuously revisited, recalibrated, and reinterpreted with every new discovery. If you could listen to your DNA as sound, it would not play a melody but a chorus, a slow, overlapping harmony of lives. Some voices are loud, others faint, yet all are necessary to make the whole. In that harmony lie the neanderthals, the denisovans, the unnamed ancestors who lived before both, and the countless lost populations whose only trace is a mutation still carried in your cells. You are, quite literally, their archive. Genomics has transformed the search for our origins from a hunt for single fossils into a reconstruction of relationships, a shift from stones to sequences. It no longer asks who was first, but how many survived long enough to leave something behind. In that sense, the story of Ancestor X is not one of discovery but of recovery, gathering the remaining threads of a tapestry that time has mostly unstitched. Each analysis adds one more thread back, though the image may never be complete. For scientists, this is both humbling and motivating. The realization that we may never find the definitive beginning does not end the search, it enriches it. Knowledge grows not by closure but by refinement. The genomes whisper that evolution was not a clean succession, but an ongoing conversation between populations, adapting, blending, and learning to endure. The ghosts in our data are the reminders that extinction and survival were once close neighbours, and that the line between them was drawn not in bloodlines, but in probability. So when you hear that your DNA contains fragments from ancient humans, remember that those fragments are not anomalies, they are continuity. They are the pieces of an inheritance that began long before our species had a name. We are the descendants of convergence, the biological memory of countless meetings in deep time. Perhaps that is the real beginning, not a single ancestor, but the first time two lineages met and exchanged more than survival. The first conversation written in code, passed forward until it became thought itself. And that, so far as we can tell, is where the data stops. Not because it has nothing left to say, but because the rest of the story is still being written inside us. Imagine this, the planet's heartbeat slowing. The familiar rhythm of ice and thaw that had pulsed every 41,000 years begins to hesitate, stretch, and stumble. Seasons of the world change their pattern, and the clockwork of climate rewrites itself. Around 900,000 years ago, Earth fell out of sync with its own past. The ice that once came and went like breathing began to linger. Glaciers stayed longer, grew thicker, and learned patience. What had once been cycles of quick winters and recoveries became ages of cold that lasted 100,000 years at a time. This quiet reshuffling of orbit and feedback would remake every ecosystem on the planet, and with it, every possibility for life. For most of the previous 2 million years, the planet had obeyed the same metronome. Ice sheets advanced and retreated like tides, driven by the subtle tilt and wobble of the planet's axis, what scientists call Milankovitch cycles. These astronomical rhythms governed the balance of sunlight across latitudes. When the Earth tilted more steeply, summers warmed enough to melt the glaciers. When the tilt flattened, winters hardened and ice grew. It was a reliable pattern. 41,000 years of pulse, 41,000 years of release. Forests would recede, deserts would expand, and then the opposite. Life adapted to this cadence. including the early humans who followed the green corridors that opened during each interglacial lull. Then something shifted deep within the machinery of climate. The mid-Pleistocene transition, as scientists now call it, was not a single event, but a long hesitation that unfolded between 900,000 and 600,000 years ago. Earth's orbit did not suddenly change. Instead, the system that translated orbital rhythm into temperature began to behave differently. Ice grew thicker in the north, reflecting more sunlight and locking the planet into deeper freezes. Ocean currents reorganized, drawing heat away from the poles more efficiently. The carbon dioxide that once cushioned each glacial retreat dropped lower than before. The old 41,000-year beat fractured and gave way to a slower, harsher tempo, roughly 100,000 years between full thaws. To understand how radical that was, imagine time itself slowing. In the earlier world, an entire landscape could be reborn within the lifespan of a species. Grasslands could turn to forest, and back again within a few thousand generations. After the transition, the cold endured long enough to erase memory. Rivers froze, ecosystems collapsed, and any creature adapted to warmth found its range shrinking like breath in winter. For the first time in history, ice did not simply visit, it conquered. During this period, vast continental glaciers thickened over what is now North America and northern Eurasia. Each advance lowered sea levels by more than 100 meters, exposing the continental shelves and creating land bridges between continents. These temporary connections opened new migration routes for animals and humans alike, but they also closed others as ice and permafrost expanded. Tropical belts narrowed. The once lush rainforests that stretched across Central Africa and Southeast Asia gave way to mosaic habitats of grassland and woodland. Deserts crept outward. Every shift redrew the map, not once, but dozens of times. The planet's surface responded like a breathing organism adjusting to stress. In regions where glaciers ground mountains to powder, new plains formed, barren but rich in minerals, waiting for wind and water to shape them. The great rivers changed course, carrying meltwater and sediment into dry basins that briefly bloomed with life before freezing again. Lakes appeared and vanished in geological heartbeats. The Sahara, which today we imagine as eternal desert, oscillated between arid dune fields and freshwater savannas, depending on the rhythm of rainfall driven by these ice ages. Ocean circulation changed as well. The closure of warm passages and the deepening of cold currents altered how heat was distributed around the planet. The North Atlantic grew saltier and heavier, pulling surface water downward and strengthening the global conveyor belt of currents that still regulates our climate today. In the Pacific, upwellings of nutrient-rich water shifted, changing the productivity of marine ecosystems. Each alteration in temperature rippled outward through the food web. Plankton blooms declined in the cold phases, reducing oxygen levels in deep water and reshaping the chemistry of the seas. On land, the consequences were equally transformative. Species adapted to narrow ecological niches vanished as their habitats collapsed. Those that survived learned flexibility, to migrate, to hibernate, or to endure hunger. Large herbivores began to move across immense distances, following the retreating edge of ice or the return of seasonal grasses. Predators followed them, forming new patterns of migration that stretched across continents. The landscapes of Eurasia and Africa became patchworks of refuges and dead zones, forcing constant movement. Every glacial advance stripped away soil and vegetation, while each retreat left behind a raw stage for new ecosystems. Evolution accelerated not by abundance, but by instability. In a world where climate flipped between extremes, the ability to adapt became more valuable than specialization. The species that endured were those capable of living in both cold and warmth, in forest and steppe, in feast and famine. The slow drumbeat of 100,000-year cycles was an evolutionary sieve, selecting for endurance and intelligence across the entire biosphere. Scientists studying sediment cores from the ocean floor have traced this transformation in microscopic detail. Layers of dust, ash, and tiny fossilized shells record the waxing and waning of ice, the shifts in ocean chemistry, and the fluctuations in atmospheric carbon dioxide. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in those shells reveals temperature changes over millions of years. When plotted as a graph, the record shows a striking pattern. Before 900,000 years ago, the peaks and valleys are frequent but shallow. Afterward, they deepen dramatically. The planet had entered a new mode of operation, colder, drier, and far less predictable. Why the change occurred is still debated. Some researchers point to a gradual cooling of the oceans as continents drifted and altered heat exchange. Others suggest that as glaciers grew thicker, they began to erode continental crust in ways that affected volcanic activity and carbon cycling. A small shift in one feedback loop could have cascaded through the system, locking Earth into a longer rhythm. What we know is that the transition did not happen overnight. It was a drawn-out negotiation between sunlight, rock, and atmosphere, with life caught in the middle. For the hominins who already walked the Earth by then, this transformation was nothing short of existential. They would have watched their familiar landscapes vanish. Rivers turn to dust, and the animals they hunted migrate beyond reach. The green corridors that once connected regions would close under ice, isolating populations for tens of thousands of years. Elsewhere, new paths would appear, dry land where there had once been sea. Migration was no longer optional, it was survival itself, and with every isolation came divergence. When groups are separated for long enough, their behaviours, bodies, and languages of gesture begin to drift apart. The mid-Pleistocene transition did not just change where humans could live, it changed who they could become. From the geological perspective, this era marks the true beginning of modern climate variability. The pattern of long glacial and short interglacial phases that continued until just 12,000 years ago. Each cold age carved its mark into the landscape. Moraines and drumlins in northern latitudes, deep loess deposits in Asia, and fossilized dune systems in Africa all bear witness to those relentless oscillations. Even today, the distribution of soil and mineral resources we exploit for agriculture and industry was shaped by those ancient glaciers grinding the planet's surface. Perhaps most remarkable is how the planet recovered from each deep freeze. As the cycles continued, each interglacial thaw brought explosive bursts of life. Forests raced across continents, rivers flooded with fish. The atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rose, warming the air and melting the ice. In those fleeting warmer periods, life reclaimed what cold had erased. But the duration of these reprieves shortened compared to the long freezes that followed. It was as if the planet had learned to ration its warmth. In this new world, landscapes became temporary and unstable. Any creature that relied on fixed territories was at risk. The lesson of the mid-Pleistocene was simple but unforgiving. Mobility equals survival. Populations that could track the shifting boundaries of habitable zones had a future. Those that stayed still disappeared with the ice. From space, if anyone had been watching, Earth during this era would have looked like a living experiment in climate mechanics. Vast white sheets pulsing outward and retreating inward, deserts breathing in rhythm with the glaciers, oceans darkening and clearing like lungs filling and emptying. Yet on the ground, it must have felt endless. Generations born and dying under the same grey sky, unaware that warmth would one day return. For scientists today, this ancient restructuring of climate remains one of the most intriguing puzzles in paleoclimatology. It marks the moment when our planet's climate system became fully nonlinear, capable of tipping into new states with small nudges. In that sense, Understanding this transition is not just an exercise in prehistory, it is a lesson in fragility. We live in the aftermath of that great recalibration, within an interglacial that still bears its fingerprints. The rhythms that shaped early humanity are the same ones that threaten our future, only accelerated by our own emissions. Standing at the edge of this knowledge, it is humbling to realise how dependent all of life has always been on celestial geometry, on the tilt of an axis, the eccentricity of an orbit, the whisper of sunlight measured in watts per square metre, a few degrees more or less, a few thousand years of timing, and the world becomes either a garden or a tomb. So what happens when Earth changes its rhythm? Everything that listens to that rhythm must change too. The forests, the oceans, the winds, and the beings who walk beneath them all learn a new dance to survive. We may not know the precise mechanisms that cause that ancient shift, but its consequences echo through every fossil, every grain of ice, every breath we take today. The mid-Pleistocene transition was not a disaster. It was an awakening, the planet discovering new ways to remember cold. Imagine this, the planet caught in a long breath of cold. Across the northern hemisphere, ice thickens mile by mile, swallowing valleys and plains, sealing rivers beneath its weight. The sound of the world changes. Forests fall silent, oceans retreat, and winds take their place. Between 800,000 and 700,000 years ago, Earth entered a deeper freeze than it had ever known. But even in this age of glaciers, life refused to disappear. It bent, adapted, retreated, and waited. Somewhere, in the narrow cracks left between frost and drought, small groups of humans, or rather, the beings who would one day become human, endured. These enclaves became what scientists now call refugia, pockets of survivable climate surrounded by landscapes of extinction. To find them, we must imagine a map unlike any we know today. The Sahara was not a desert of sand, but a patchwork of dust plains and temporary grasslands, expanding and shrinking with each glacial pulse. The Mediterranean basin stood half-drained, its coastline a labyrinth of salt flats. The great forests of Europe and northern Asia were gone, replaced by frozen tundra where mammoths and steppe bison ranged in herds. In contrast, the tropics grew dry and fragmented. Rainforests shrank to isolated islands of green surrounded by savanna. Africa itself, the supposed cradle of humankind, was no sanctuary but a land of contrasts. Desiccated in the north, lush only along a few rivers and highlands. Yet within these fragments, life clung on. Paleoclimatologists studying pollen trapped in ancient lake beds can still trace the rhythm of survival. Around this time, lakes in East Africa, such as those in the Rift Valley, repeatedly shrank and refilled. Each low stand revealed that drought could last for centuries, reducing entire ecosystems to narrow ribbons of wetland along mountain foothills. These belts became the lifelines for plants, animals, and early humans alike. The Ethiopian highlands, for instance, stood high enough to catch moisture when the lowlands withered. There, cooler air and seasonal rain may have preserved a stable habitat when much of the continent turned to dust. Further south, the Cape region likely served as another refuge. Its unique geography trapped oceanic fog and seasonal rains, maintaining vegetation when the rest of southern Africa dried out. Fossilised pollen and isotopic records suggest that small pockets of fynbos and woodland persisted even at glacial peaks, sustaining grazing herds and indirectly the hunters who followed them. If we imagine those humans, they would have lived not in abundance, but in cycles of hunger and adaptation, moving along coastal ridges, gathering shellfish, scavenging carcasses left by predators. Each generation learned to read the narrow window between survival and collapse. Across the Red Sea, similar sanctuaries existed in the Levant. In that corridor between Africa and Eurasia, alternating wet and dry phases sculpted a dynamic environment of oases and savannas that appeared like mirages and vanished just as quickly. Caves in the hills of modern Israel and Jordan preserve traces of ancient soil layers rich in ash and charcoal. Signs that, even in the coldest periods, fire still burned there. Those who found shelter along the Jordan Valley or the Mediterranean coast would have experienced milder winters and access to migrating herds. They were not isolated from the rest of the world, but their survival depended on a delicate equilibrium. A few hundred kilometres too far north, ice. Too far south, drought. Between them, a narrow corridor where life still had texture. To the east, the Indian subcontinent offered its own refuge, not continuous, but scattered across monsoon-fed regions that resisted total desiccation. During the mid-Pleistocene transition, monsoon systems weakened under the growing influence of global ice, yet they never disappeared entirely. Periods of strong rainfall carved fertile belts along river valleys such as the Narmada and the Ganges, while upland plateaus provided shelter from seasonal floods. Paleosols, ancient soils preserved in these regions, reveal alternating layers of red, iron-rich sediment and dark organic matter, each corresponding to shifts between wet and dry cycles. These bands of soil are, in effect, the heartbeat of an ancient climate, marking when life could return and when it retreated again. Even further east, Southeast Asia remained a mosaic of refuges hidden within tropical forests. The lowering of sea levels exposed vast land bridges connecting what are now islands. Java, Sumatra and Borneo merged into the greater subcontinent known as Sundaland. During glacial lows, this region expanded into one of the most biologically rich refuges on Earth, a complex of rivers, coastal plains, and forested hills. Here, heavy rainfall persisted even when global temperatures plummeted. Fossil evidence from caves across the region shows continuous habitation, a sign that some populations may never have experienced the full brutality of the northern ice. For these communities, the world's great freeze was something distant, a rumour carried on the wind, while their own battle was with heat, monsoons, and shifting coastlines. What unites all these places, Africa's highlands, the Levant's valleys, India's river basins, and the forests of Southeast Asia, is that they functioned as biological and cultural greenhouses. Isolated populations trapped within them faced different selective pressures, and over time those pressures sculpted their bodies, minds, and tools in unique ways. Where the environment offered abundance, stability encouraged experimentation, new ways of knapping stone, new forms of cooperation. Where it offered scarcity, ingenuity became necessity, the need to conserve water, to share food, to travel farther. Evolution does not occur in comfort. It thrives in the margins. This pattern, which ecologists call island biogeography, applies even on continents. Each refugee was an island of habitability in a sea of hostile terrain. When the climate briefly warmed and the seas rose, these islands reconnected, allowing the exchange of genes and ideas between populations. Then the cold would return, isolating them once more. Over hundreds of thousands of years, such cycles of isolation and reunion created a complex network of microevolutions, local adaptations that together formed the foundation for later diversity among humans. The global freeze, paradoxically, may have been the condition that made our eventual flexibility possible. Sediment cores from the Arabian Sea record these changes with uncanny precision. Layers rich in planktonic microfossils correspond to periods when monsoon winds strengthened, carrying nutrients from rivers to the ocean. Layers poor in such fossils mark arid phases, when dust replaced rainfall and productivity collapsed. Each oscillation mirrors the waxing and waning of life on land. Climate, ocean, and biology were in conversation, one long, slow dialogue that every organism was forced to answer. In the caves of coastal East Africa, microscopic analysis of stone tools reveals another adaptation to environmental stress. tools became smaller, more efficient, designed to conserve scarce resources. The very shape of survival was being refined. Those who endured in these refuges learned not just to hunt or gather, but to think ahead, to plan for seasons of absence, to store, to share. In that sense, the preservation of thought itself, abstract anticipatory thought, depended on geography. Where the climate oscillated between extremes, the mind learned to oscillate too, between fear and invention. There is no single record of these people, no name or face. Only the environmental traces remain. Isotopes in stalagmites, pollen trapped in sediment, the subtle chemistry of ancient soil. Each data point is a whisper from a vanished world saying, "Here, life held on." Scientists use these whispers to reconstruct maps of past rainfall, temperature, and vegetation cover. The resulting images show streaks of green amid a planet otherwise beige and white, the last strongholds of warmth and water. To walk those maps in imagination is to understand that survival was not global but local, not inevitable but accidental. If we look at the modern world, we can still see the ghosts of those refuges. Biodiversity hotspots, regions with extraordinary numbers of endemic species, often overlap with the same zones that remained habitable during the Great Ice Ages. Mountains that once provided shelter for ancient humans now shelter rare plants and animals. The resilience encoded there is ancient, older than humanity as we know it. The highlands of Ethiopia, the coastal forests of South Africa, the rainforests of Borneo, the limestone caves of Java, each is a living fossil of stability in an unstable world. The idea that thought itself survived in these places is not poetic exaggeration, but an evolutionary truth. The cognitive continuity between those isolated populations, separated by thousands of kilometres, yet driven by the same challenges, laid the groundwork for something universal: adaptability. In every refuge, problem-solving evolved independently, shaped by local pressures but converging toward the same outcome, a brain capable of abstraction and cooperation. Parallel evolution under stress is one of nature's quiet masterpieces. As the world eventually warmed again, the glaciers retreated and deserts greened. Populations once cut off from one another began to move, following rivers newly born from melting ice. They carried with them not only their genes but their strategies, their learned behaviours, their memory of endurance. When these groups met after tens of thousands of years apart, they would not have recognised their kinship. Yet the rhythm of survival they shared was the same. Out of those meetings, humanity's next chapters would unfold. What the mid-Pleistocene cold had scattered, the warmth would slowly gather again. But something irreversible had happened in that long freeze. The planet had tested its inhabitants and found only a few able to persist in the narrow spaces left open by the climate. Every species that followed, including ours, descended from those who survived in the refuge of a frozen world. Their persistence was the rehearsal for all future resilience. Perhaps that is the lesson written between the lines of climate and time. Intelligence is not the opposite of environment, but its echo. Every thought we have ever had, every act of curiosity or invention, descends from a lineage that once learned to keep thinking in the cold. And as our own world now begins to change again, faster than ever, it's worth remembering that survival has never belonged to the strongest or the most numerous, but to those who could still imagine when the horizon froze. Imagine this, a night with no moon, 800,000 years ago. Wind whispering across a shallow lake in what is now the northern Jordan Valley. The air is cold enough to bite. In the distance, the soft crackle of something unnatural cuts through the silence, not lightning, not wildfire. Something smaller, steadier, almost rhythmic. A handful of early humans are seated around the flicker of a controlled flame. the first fire that did not die when the wind rose. And in that trembling circle of light, a new kind of mind was being tested. At Gesher Beno Yaakov, a lakeshore site buried beneath millennia of sediment and silt, archaeologists uncovered a thin black layer, a subtle band of carbon and ash trapped between lenses of clay. To the naked eye, it is unremarkable, a faint stain in the earth. But under the microscope it becomes a story. Wood charcoal fractured by heat, plant remains warped by flame, fish bones reddened at precise temperatures, and stone tools lying just where hands had left them. All of it dates to roughly 780,000 years ago. For the first time in the record, fire is not an accident. It is a companion. Until this point, the evidence for fire in human evolution had been episodic. Lightning strikes, burned bones, or ash deposits possibly left by natural wildfires. But what makes Gesher Ben Yaakov extraordinary is its consistency. Fire appears in multiple layers over tens of thousands of years, each showing the same pattern. Hearth-like concentrations, repeated use of the same locations, and remains of plants and animals altered by controlled heat. Whoever lived there had learned not only to use fire but to keep it alive. This is the moment when technology ceased to be external. A stone tool can be made and abandoned. Fire, by contrast, must be nurtured. It demands constant attention, protection from wind and rain, and a memory of how to rekindle it. To control fire is to think in time, to plan ahead, to imagine absence, to foresee loss. The embers at Gesher Benot Yaakov were not just the first hearths, they were the first clocks. The site itself, perched along the ancient banks of the Hula Lake, was a crossroads of ecosystems. Fossil pollen shows dense stands of oak and olive trees growing nearby, while freshwater mollusks and charred seeds tell of a rich wetland environment. The inhabitants fished, gathered edible nuts, and hunted large mammals along the water's edge. In this mosaic landscape, fire would have been both tool and signal, driving animals, clearing brush, roasting food, and warding off predators. The alternating wet and dry seasons of the region made lightning fires rare, suggesting that the groups who lived there had either carried embers from natural sources or learned the skill of maintaining them through the changing climate. One of the most remarkable finds at the site is the variety of burned materials. Seeds from wild water plants, nutshells, and wood fragments from multiple tree species all show distinct signatures of charring at temperatures consistent with controlled, low-intensity fires rather than open conflagrations. This suggests not a single fire but a long tradition, generations tending, feeding, and possibly even teaching firekeeping. Whether they knew how to ignite flame from scratch remains uncertain. But the persistence of these hearths implies an unbroken chain of knowledge, passed not through speech as we know it, but through imitation and ritualized gesture. There are other places from roughly the same time that tell similar stories. In northern China, ash layers and reddened sediments have been found at Zhoukudian, where humans lived in caves surrounded by permafrost. In Europe, hints of ancient fire appear in sites like Terra Amata and Beech's Pit, although the evidence there is younger. The global distribution of these traces suggests that the mastery of fire was not a single invention by one lineage, but a convergent adaptation, a shared solution to the same environmental problem. As the world grew colder, survival began to depend not just on what one could find, but on what one could create. Controlled fire changed everything. It softened food, allowing digestion of roots and tubers that would otherwise be indigestible. It extended the day, letting social life unfold after dark. It hardened wooden tools, preserved meat, and offered warmth in regions that had once been lethal. But its most profound impact was invisible. It changed how early humans perceived time. To maintain fire, one had to think beyond the present, to guard the coals through sleep, to collect fuel before nightfall, to anticipate the next storm. In this way, the mastery of fire was the beginning of foresight. Some researchers see in this period the first signs of what might be called cognitive ecology, the co-evolution of mind and environment. Fire imposed a rhythm that mirrored the new climate cycles described by geology, long durations of maintenance punctuated by sudden catastrophe. If the mid-Pleistocene taught humans to endure the cold, fire taught them to endure time itself. Archaeomagnetic analysis at Gesher Beno Yaakov reveals the subtle layering of multiple burning events, each distinct in composition but recurring in the same spatial clusters. This indicates that the inhabitants returned to specific spots repeatedly, suggesting spatial memory and possibly a sense of place. It is here that the mental shift from wandering to settling may have begun, not in permanent villages, but around the first circles of light carved out from darkness. The burned remains of fish at the site tell another story. Microscopic fractures in their bones show exposure to temperatures between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius, optimal for cooking but too low for natural wildfire. The fish were caught, processed, and cooked deliberately. Long before pottery or metallurgy, long before anyone gave names to such acts. That simplicity conceals its magnitude. Cooking made food safer, more digestible, and energy-rich, possibly fueling the growth of the brain itself. It is one of the few moments in prehistory when technology, biology, and environment all align into a single feedback loop. To think of fire as technology is to miss its emotional dimension. It is also an experience, an ancient form of companionship. In that flickering light, fear diminishes. The unseen predators stay at the edge of vision. The cold recedes. For early humans, night no longer belonged to the world, it belonged to them. Fire made darkness visible, and in doing so made thought itself visible. The pattern of control seen at Gesher Benot Yaakov suggests something else too: cooperation. A fire cannot be maintained by one person alone. It requires rotation, shared vigilance, and perhaps even social rules about who feeds it and when. Around those first hearths, communication may have deepened. Gestures turned into signals, signals into rhythms of labour. The social dimension of fire may have been as revolutionary as its practical one. The geological preservation of the site gives us a snapshot of stability amid a chaotic world. Sediment analysis shows that the region experienced repeated flooding, yet each time the inhabitants returned. The fire traces reappear above the flood layers, as if each generation rebuilt the same habit after each disruption. That persistence speaks of more than adaptation. It speaks of cultural continuity, of traditions surviving even as environments shifted. Some scientists argue that the control of fire must have occurred earlier, perhaps as far back as 1 million years ago. Evidence from other sites hints at that possibility, but none display the same consistency as Gesher Benot Yaakov. Whether the discovery was made once or many times independently, by different populations scattered across the continents, remains one of the open questions in anthropology. The truth may be more complex, a shared threshold reached by multiple groups as they face the same constraints of cold, darkness, and hunger. In that sense, fire was not invented. It was remembered by the species itself, an echo of lightning tamed into ritual. When we look at the archaeological record today, the pattern of burned layers seems almost modest, but from a cognitive perspective, it marks one of the deepest transformations in human history, perhaps deeper even than agriculture or art. Fire demanded attention, restraint, and imagination. It required that knowledge be kept alive not through instinct, but through teaching. Once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Imagine again that lakeshore night. Sparks rise into the wind, disappearing into a sky crowded with unfamiliar stars. The faces around the fire are lit in amber, eyes reflecting light that their ancestors had never seen this close before. They're unaware of what they have done. They do not know that this glow will one day illuminate every city, every home, every screen. They only know that warmth has been wrestled from the world and that it can be kept. Whether that fire belonged to one lineage or to all of them may never be answered. What matters is that from this point onward, fire belonged to thought. It was the first shared technology, the first mirror in which the human mind saw itself reflected in motion and light. What if I told you that the oldest faces we've ever found are not carved in art but in bone? Silent expressions pressed into stone for hundreds of thousands of years, waiting for us to learn their language. Around 750,000 years ago, in what we now call East Asia, a series of remarkable fossils began to write a new and deeply puzzling story about who we were becoming. Their features are both familiar and alien, too advanced to belong to Homo erectus, yet too ancient to belong to anything recognisably modern. They are the faces in between, the ones evolution almost forgot to explain. These are not the neat textbook skulls of Europe's cavemen or Africa's early sapiens. These are weathered and crushed remnants of lives lived in the shadow of volcanic mountains and monsoon plains. The skull from Dali in central China, the partial cranium of Jinyashan in the northeast, and the enigmatic Yunxian fossils from the banks of the Han River. Together, they span a crucial window in time between roughly 750 and 700,000 years ago, when the lineages that would one day shape modern humanity were still intertwined, unclassified, and unnamed. Let us begin in the lowest plateau of China, in the region of Dali. There, in sediments layered with ancient dust blown from the Gobi, a nearly complete skull was found in the 1970s. The Dali cranium is extraordinary not for its perfection, but for its contradiction. Its brain case is large, approaching 1,300 cubic centimetres, well within the range of later humans. Yet its brow ridge is massive and continuous, more like that of earlier Homo erectus. The face projects forward, but not as sharply. The nasal opening is broad, suggesting adaptation to cold, dry air. Each feature points in a different evolutionary direction, as though the skull were caught mid-sentence between species. Nearby sites, like Jinyashan, tell a similar story. The partial skull and associated bones discovered there belong to an individual who lived roughly 200,000 years later, but still carries the same mosaic of traits. The cranial vault is high and rounded, the bones lighter than those of Homo erectus, the brain volume again large. Yet the thick cranial walls and robust facial structure speak of a lineage that had not yet softened into the anatomies we know. It is as if evolution was experimenting with design, enlarging the brain while still clinging to the architecture of survival. And then there is Yunxian, a name that has re-entered the conversation only recently. Two skulls, discovered in the 1980s in Hubei province, were crushed and distorted beyond easy recognition. For decades, their place in the human family tree remained uncertain. But with modern digital reconstruction, the Yunxian fossils have begun to reveal their true shape. Using high-resolution CT scans, researchers have virtually separated each bone fragment from its matrix, digitally corrected the deformations caused by millennia of pressure, and reassembled the cranium as it once was. The result is striking. The Yunxian skulls do not fit neatly within Homo erectus. Their cranial capacity and facial proportions fall somewhere between that species and the later archaic humans of Asia. When all these specimens, Dali, Jinyashan and Yunxian, are compared in three-dimensional morphometric space, they form a bridge. Not a straight line, but a spectrum connecting the old and the new. Their measurements show gradual increases in brain size, thinning of cranial bones, and subtle reshaping of the face. This transition does not appear to be abrupt or confined to one region. It unfolds across Asia, over hundreds of thousands of years, like a long, slow tide of anatomical change. If these skulls could speak, they would tell a story of resilience and adaptation across glacial cycles that reshaped their world. The people of this time lived through the mid-Pleistocene transition, the era when ice ages lengthened and ecosystems fractured. The fossils themselves are geological witnesses to those environmental upheavals. The sediments in which they were found are filled with loess and volcanic ash, signals of cold winds and distant eruptions. In such conditions, survival would have demanded not only physical endurance, but new behavioural flexibility, scavenging, hunting, seasonal movement, perhaps even the use of fire and tools made with forethought. What makes the Asian record particularly intriguing is its continuity. While in Europe and Africa the fossil trail jumps between species with clear boundaries, in East Asia the record blurs. It's as though evolution here flowed more gradually, without the sharp divisions we like to draw in hindsight. Some paleoanthropologists argue that these fossils represent a long, locally evolving lineage of humans that persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, parallel to, but connected with, populations elsewhere. Others see them as evidence of migration and interbreeding, waves of movement across continents, each leaving traces in bone. Digital reconstruction has transformed how we read these faces. What once seemed fragmented and ambiguous now appears almost alive. Subtle details like the shape of the eye sockets or the angle of the zygomatic arch reveal patterns invisible to earlier study. For example, the Yunxian skull's midface resembles that of the later Dali specimen, implying continuity of local populations rather than replacement. The cranial vault, though smaller, shows the beginnings of the rounded form that would later characterize more derived humans. This suggests that what we think of as modern traits may have roots scattered across time and geography, emerging wherever survival demanded them. At the same time, the variation among these fossils defies simple classification. If we place them all under Homo erectus, we risk erasing the uniqueness of their transitional features. But if we elevate them to a new species, we risk fracturing a continuum into artificial categories. That uncertainty sits at the heart of paleoanthropology, the humility of knowing that evolution is not a ladder but a web. Each fossil is a word from a language of change, and we are still learning how to read it. The geological dating of these sites adds another layer to the mystery. Magnetic reversals in the surrounding sediments, Earth's periodic flipping of its magnetic poles, provide reliable chronological markers. The Yunxian fossils, for instance, were sealed beneath layers corresponding to the Matuyama-Brunner boundary, placing them securely before 170,000 years ago. The Dali skull, younger, sits around 300,000, while Jinyashan, younger still, nears 200,000. This temporal spread hints that East Asia may have hosted continuous human occupation through multiple glacial cycles, a stability rare elsewhere. The environment around these fossils was diverse and dynamic. Pollen and faunal remains suggest temperate woodlands interspersed with open steppe, rivers cutting through fertile valleys, and periodic volcanic activity enriching the soil. The tools found nearby, simple flakes, choppers, and hand axes, show technological persistence rather than revolution. That constancy may not signal stagnation but adaptation, a toolkit refined for a landscape that remained broadly familiar despite the swings of climate. Some researchers now propose that these populations, long isolated yet periodically connected to the West through Central Asia, could represent the elusive ancestor X, the shared forebear of the lineages that would later diverge in distinct forms. If so, this would shift the centre of gravity of human evolution eastward, away from the narrow confines of Africa or Europe, and into a truly pan-old world story. Yet it's important to remember that such hypotheses remain speculative. Fossils alone cannot reveal genetic relationships, and the DNA of these ancient bones has not survived. All we can do is compare shapes, measurements, and the silent geometry of skulls. What the data do show is convergence. Across time, the Asian fossils trend toward the same anatomical direction seen in other parts of the world: higher cranial vaults, reduced prognathism, and larger brains. Whether this reflects shared ancestry or parallel adaptation remains open, but it suggests that evolution was not waiting in one place for the modern human to appear. It was unfolding simultaneously in many places shaped by similar constraints and opportunities. In modern labs, when these fossils are scanned and digitally reconstructed, they seem to come alive again, not as museum relics, but as individuals. The Dali skull, restored to its full form, bears a quiet expression. Heavy brow, broad face, deep-set eyes. The Jinitian reconstruction, likely female, looks strong yet delicate, the curvature of the skull subtly more human than ape. The Yunxian face, though crushed and incomplete, carries an almost melancholic symmetry, as if time itself pressed its hand into the bone. These reconstructions are not just images, they are dialogues across time, attempts to understand a kind of humanity that no longer exists yet never fully vanished. When you place all three side by side, Dali, Jinitian and Yunxian, you see not evolution as progress, but as persistence. The same bones repeating their lessons through millennia, refining but never erasing what came before. It is possible that Asia was not the periphery of human evolution, as once thought, but one of its quiet engines, a region where ancient populations endured long enough to shape the genetic and anatomical landscape we inherited. Still, we must speak cautiously. Each fossil is a fragment, and fragments can mislead. What we call continuity could be coincidence. What we see as transition could be parallel invention. Science advances by doubt, and these skulls remind us of that. Yet even in uncertainty there is a strange comfort, that our story is older and broader than we imagined, written not in straight lines but in circles of resemblance across continents. If these skulls could speak, perhaps they would not speak in words at all. Perhaps their language would be the subtle grammar of bone, the widening of a cranial vault, the thickening of a ridge, the curve of a jaw reshaped by countless generations of wind, hunger and time. And perhaps what they would tell us is simple, that humanity was never a single place or moment, but a conversation carried on in flesh and fire across the ages. What if I told you that a skull once flattened by time, buried for 1,000,000 years beneath the silt of a river in China, might be rewriting the story of who we came from? Not by what it looks like, but by what it doesn't. The fossil known as Yunxian II is one of the most distorted human remains ever discovered, a puzzle of crushed bone fragments and compacted sediment. Yet when scientists finally reconstructed it with modern technology, what emerged was something unexpected. A face that didn't quite fit anywhere on our evolutionary map. Not fully Homo erectus, not yet anything recognisably modern, but something in between. A shape that whispered of a missing ancestor, older than we ever thought possible. The story of Yunxian begins in the late 1980s, on the banks of the Han River in Hubei province, central China. Workers quarrying for building materials uncovered a layer of sediment rich with fossilised bones, rhinoceroses, elephants, and deer from a time when the landscape was greener and the climate milder. In that layer lay the fragmented remains of a human skull, heavily distorted and pressed flat by the immense weight of geological time. The fossil, later named Yunxian II, was so deformed that for decades scientists couldn't tell exactly what they were looking at. The bones were real, that much was certain, but their story was hidden behind the scars of deep time. For years the skull was classified conservatively as Homo erectus, part of a species long thought to represent the first wave of humans to leave Africa nearly 2 million years ago. But there was something unsettling about Yunxian's proportions. The cranial capacity seemed too large, the curvature of the skull too high, and the shape of the brow ridge too subtle. Even the orientation of the face, slightly forward but less protruding than expected, did not quite align with known erectus fossils from Asia. It was as if the skull was trying to evolve towards something new, but had frozen mid-transition. The puzzle began to change only recently, when technology finally caught up with curiosity. In 2024, a team of paleoanthropologists led by Chinese and European researchers performed a complete digital reconstruction of the Yunxian II cranium using high-resolution CT scanning and 3D modelling. Each fragment of bone, hundreds of them, was virtually isolated, corrected for distortion, and realigned according to microanatomical landmarks. The process took months of computational analysis. When the model was finally assembled, the results stunned everyone who saw it. What emerged was not an erectus skull as expected, but a mosaic of features that linked it to something more complex. The cranial volume, estimated between 1,100 to 1,200 cubic centimetres, was significantly larger than that of typical Homo erectus individuals from the same period. The vault was higher and more rounded with thinner cranial walls. The base of the skull, often a key indicator of evolutionary relationships, showed a modern-like flexure rather than the flat, primitive configuration of earlier species. These were not trivial differences, they were signs of a brain and body beginning to take a new form. When researchers compared the digital model to dozens of other hominin fossils across Africa, Europe and Asia, the Yunxian II specimen clustered not with classic Homo erectus, but closer to later archaic humans, those associated with what would much later be identified as the denisovan lineage. Statistical morphology, the science of quantifying anatomical similarity, showed that Yunxian II occupied an intermediate position between known erectus specimens like Jokudian and the later skulls from Delhi and Jinnushan. It seemed to mark a phase of evolution that connected early migrants out of Africa with the forms that would eventually diversify across Eurasia. The implication was staggering. If Yunxian II truly represents a population related to the early ancestors of denisovans, a branch of humanity that genetic data suggests split from the main lineage more than 1 million years ago, then our timeline of divergence is off by hundreds of thousands of years. The family tree of humans, long drawn as a tidy sequence of migrations, becomes a web of overlapping experiments. Instead of one lineage radiating outward from Africa, we see multiple lineages adapting simultaneously across continents, responding to the same climatic pressures but in different ways. The team's morphological analysis also highlighted another intriguing pattern. The face of Yunxian II combines archaic and derived traits in ways not seen elsewhere. The nasal aperture is broad, consistent with adaptation to a cooler, drier environment. The cheeks are wide and flared, yet the mid-face does not project as strongly as in Homo erectus. The brow ridge is continuous but less pronounced, and the cranial base hints at a vertical posture of the face more similar to later species. These features suggest not random variation but directional change, a slow, regionally evolving population adjusting to both climate and cognition. And yet, despite these clues, the fossil offers no easy answers. The DNA that could have confirmed its genetic identity is long gone, destroyed by time and temperature. The sediment surrounding the fossil has yielded no preserved proteins, no ancient biomolecules to tie it directly to known lineages. All we have are shapes, but in paleoanthropology, shape is language. Each contour is a word, each ridge a syllable in the story of evolution. Reading that story requires both science and restraint. To place Yunxian II in its proper context, we must also consider its age. Paleomagnetic dating of the layers surrounding the fossil places it firmly between 1.1 and 900,000 years ago, at the threshold of the mid-Pleistocene transition. This was the time when Earth's climate began to oscillate between prolonged glacial and interglacial cycles, transforming the geography of survival. Populations isolated by expanding deserts and glaciers would have faced intense selection pressures, precisely the conditions that can drive divergence. In that sense, Yunxian II is not just a fossil, it is a climatic witness, its very anatomy a record of adaptation to a world in flux. What the digital reconstruction made visible is that evolutionary change does not happen all at once or in one place. Instead, it flickers, appearing, disappearing, and reappearing across time like sparks in the dark. The people of Yunxian 2's world would have walked through forests of oak and pine, hunted deer and elephants, and used simple but effective stone tools to process meat and hide. They might have known fire, or at least kept embers when nature offered them. Their survival depended not just on muscle, but on memory. The ability to recognize safe places, recall migrations of animals, and teach these lessons to others. Each of those capacities leaves no fossil, yet they live between the lines of the bones. When viewed alongside fossils from Delhi and Jinyashan, Yunxian 2 helps fill a gap that has long haunted evolutionary models, the million-year shadow. For decades, scientists have struggled to explain what happened between the rise of Homo erectus 2 million years ago and the appearance of clearly distinct populations later in the Pleistocene. The Yunxian discovery suggests that part of the answer may lie in East Asia, where evolution followed its own tempo, slower, perhaps, but steady, shaped by the rhythm of monsoons and ice ages, rather than abrupt environmental shocks. One of the most striking outcomes of the new study is the proposed timeline of divergence. By comparing Yunxian 2's morphological distances to those of later Denisovan-like fossils, researchers inferred that the population it represents must have branched off from the common ancestor of later humans more than 1 million years ago. This predates earlier genetic estimates and implies that the earliest stages of our shared ancestry might have unfolded not solely in Africa, but in a broader Afro-Eurasian context. Evolution, it seems, was never provincial. Still, the interpretation is not without controversy. Some scientists caution that the morphological overlap between Asian and African fossils could result from convergent evolution, similar adaptations to similar environments, not necessarily shared ancestry. Others argue that the Yunxian 2 reconstruction may emphasize derived features that were present in some erectus populations but did not signify a distinct lineage. The debate underscores how fragile every conclusion is when drawn from bone. Paleoanthropology, at its best, is not about certainty but about refining doubt. In the end, the significance of Yunxian 2 may not lie in whether it belonged to one species or another, but in what it tells us about the nature of human evolution itself. The fossil reminds us that progress is not a march toward modernity, but a dialogue with time. Each lineage carries forward traces of others, blending and branching in ways that defy neat classification. What we call missing links are not missing at all. They are simply misunderstood intersections of complexity. Today, when the digital reconstruction of Yunxian 2 is rendered on a screen, you can rotate it in 3 dimensions. You can look into the hollow sockets where eyes once watched firelight, trace the curve of a forehead that once held thought, and imagine breath moving through the same nasal passages that endured 1 million winters. The face that emerges is not foreign. It is hauntingly familiar, as if some deep part of our anatomy still remembers it. So can a crushed skull change the shape of a family tree? In a sense, it already has. It reminds us that the story of humanity is still unfolding, that every fossil we find is not an answer, but a question, and that our lineage may be older, wider, and more intricate than we ever dared to believe. What if I told you that once, long before we had words, nations, or even names, our entire species may have been reduced to a population smaller than a modern village? Around 740,000 years ago, something happened to the lineage that would later give rise to humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The evidence for it doesn't lie in fossils or stone tools, but in the silent code written into every one of our cells. When geneticists began decoding ancient DNA and comparing genomes across modern humans and archaic relatives, they noticed an odd signature buried deep in our genetic history, a dramatic narrowing of diversity. It looked as though the ancestors of all later humans had passed through an evolutionary bottleneck so severe that only about 1,000 breeding individuals may have survived for tens of thousands of years. 1,000 individuals out of millions. One small thread of survival stretched across an ice age. To understand how scientists arrived at this number, we need to step into the strange language of population genetics. Our DNA carries not just information about who we are, but how many of us there once were. Every generation, random mutations accumulate in our genomes, small copying errors that occur as DNA is passed from parent to offspring. The more people there are, the more chances mutations have to appear and spread. When genetic diversity suddenly drops, it leaves a measurable scar in the genome, a compression of variation that acts like a timestamp. Around the early Middle Pleistocene, this signature appears across all descendant human lineages, suggesting a shared crisis that nearly erased us before we truly began. What could have caused such a collapse? One clue lies in the climate record. Around 740,000 years ago, Earth was entering one of its most severe glaciations, known to paleoclimatologists as marine isotope stage 16. The planet's rhythm of ice and warmth had recently shifted from shorter, 41,000-year pulses to longer, more extreme 100,000-year cycles. During this transition, the climate became not just colder, but more unstable, with glacial advances reaching deeper into the continents and interglacials that were shorter and weaker. Vast areas of Africa and Eurasia would have turned to dust and ice. Forests retreated, grasslands failed, rivers dried. Populations of early humans, already scattered and small, would have been squeezed into shrinking habitable zones where food and water still existed. In such times, survival becomes a matter of luck as much as adaptation. When the environment fractures, populations fragment. Small groups become isolated by deserts or glaciers, unable to interbreed with others. Over time, genetic drift, the random loss of diversity from one generation to the next, takes hold. If a severe bottleneck lasts long enough, even neutral genes disappear, leaving only the faintest echo of what once was. By comparing the patterns of genetic variation across living humans and extrapolating backward, computational models suggest that our shared ancestors hovered near extinction for perhaps 100,000 years. The number is debated, but the signal is real. All later, humanity emerged from that crucible. For perspective, an effective population size of 1,000 doesn't mean there were only 1,000 individuals alive. The real number could have been several thousand more, but only about 1,000 were breeding and passing on genes to the next generations. Even so, this represents an unimaginably narrow bottleneck. Such an event would have magnified the effects of chance. A single storm, drought or disease could have shifted the course of evolution simply by killing the wrong family. When survival depends on so few, randomness becomes destiny. Interestingly, the genetic bottleneck does not appear to be unique to our lineage. Other species, from big cats to mammoths, show similar population contractions during the same glacial interval. It seems that marine isotope stage 16 was not merely a cold period, it was a global ecological upheaval. Ocean sediments show a sharp drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide. Dust records from Antarctica and the Chinese Loess Plateau reveal widespread aridity. Even tropical Africa saw cycles of megadroughts, fragmenting habitats that had previously supported early hominins. If you imagine the world then, it was not a single frozen ball of ice, but a planet of shifting extremes, glaciers grinding down mountains in the north, wind-blown dust choking the tropics, monsoon systems collapsing, and coastlines pulling back hundreds of kilometres. In that unstable world, the ancestors of humanity might have found themselves trapped between fire and frost, surviving on the edge of ecological collapse. When populations become this small, evolution behaves differently. Normally, natural selection filters harmful mutations efficiently, because large populations have enough variation for advantageous traits to spread. But when only a few thousand individuals remain, randomness dominates. Slightly harmful mutations can accumulate simply because there are not enough individuals for natural selection to weed them out. Over time, this can erode overall fitness, a process geneticists call mutational load. Yet paradoxically, small populations can also evolve faster in certain ways. With fewer individuals, beneficial mutations can sweep through the population more quickly, unopposed by competing variations. The result is an unpredictable mix of fragility and innovation. Some scientists speculate that this instability may have set the stage for later cognitive and physiological changes, not because it made humans smarter, but because it made survival depend on adaptability. The genetic record does not tell us where these survivors lived. The bottleneck is visible globally, not regionally, implying that the ancestral population was already widely dispersed but interconnected enough to share the same fate. Some models place the refuge somewhere in Africa, where fluctuating lakes and savannas could have sustained small groups through the cold. Others imagine isolated populations across the southern Levant or South Asia. What matters is that every living human, every genome on Earth, traces back to this narrow period when the lineage of humanity almost vanished. If we could travel back to that world, we would not recognize it as ours. The nights would be colder and clearer, the air thinner with carbon dioxide, the seasons sharper. Vast herds of herbivores would migrate across plains punctuated by glacial dust storms. Fire, if it was used, would flicker as both tool and guardian against darkness. The people of that age would have been strong, lean, and wary, carrying the accumulated knowledge of generations in their hands. Which stones could spark flame? Which plants were safe? Which caves stayed dry in the rain? Their minds would have been our minds in the making, shaped by scarcity and memory. It is strange to think that geneticists can detect this story without ever touching a fossil. The signal of the bottleneck was found by comparing the distribution of mutations, called single nucleotide polymorphisms, across modern genomes, and reconstructing how those patterns would change under different population sizes. The models show a dramatic dip in diversity followed by slow recovery, like the contraction and release of a heartbeat. In that contraction, the entire genetic future of humanity was squeezed through an eye of the needle. Everything that followed, our adaptability, our creativity, even our capacity for language, passed through those few thousand lives. And yet, for all its precision, the genetic evidence raises as many questions as it answers. How do we reconcile this bottleneck with the fossil record, which shows populations in both Africa and Asia surviving through this period? Perhaps the bottleneck did not mean complete isolation, but a drastic reduction in connectivity, a world of scattered enclaves surviving on the periphery. Or perhaps the genetic signal reflects not one single event, but repeated population crashes that compounded over time. In either case, it reminds us that survival is not a given. It is an unbroken chain of improbabilities. From a scientific standpoint, the bottleneck also has a curious implication. If the effective population of our ancestors was so small, then much of our shared genetic variation today is extremely young. Most of the diversity among humans has accumulated only in the last 500,000 years, long after that bottleneck eased. That means our species is genetically young, even if our lineage is ancient. We carry the scars of near extinction in our DNA, regions of the genome where variation remains lower than expected, silent witnesses to an age of scarcity. Imagine what it felt like to live through that time. Every birth would have mattered. Every loss would have echoed through generations. Each small group, perhaps numbering only a few dozen, would have been both a world and a gamble. The only continuity between the past and a future they would never see. The wonder is not that so many perished, but that any survived at all. Today, When scientists feed these data into models and run them backward through time, they see not a line, but a pulse, a rhythmic expansion and contraction of life over hundreds of thousands of years. The bottleneck of 740,000 years ago stands out as one of the deepest troughs in that pulse. Without those few thousand ancestors who endured the ice, the dust and the darkness, the rest of our story would not exist. So how close did humanity come to ending before it began? Perhaps closer than we will ever fully understand. The genetic record shows we teetered on the edge, reduced to the smallest echo of a species, and yet that echo carried forward the potential for everything that followed. All the art, the firelight, the questions, the songs, all compressed once into the genome of 1,000 fragile survivors. Every human alive today carries a trace of that improbability, written quietly in the code of life itself. What if evolution didn't choose one path, but four? Around 700,000 years ago, the lineage that would one day lead to us began to branch in silence. No single species stood at the centre. No single skull or fossil marks the moment. Instead, a slow genetic drift, spread across continents, climates, and generations, began to fracture what had once been one population into several distinct lineages. The world itself demanded it. Ice sheets advanced and retreated with new ferocity, carving continents into islands of survival. Forests became deserts, plains became tundra, and every change redrew the boundaries of possibility. From those environmental pressures came four children of the cold, the ancestors of neanderthals, denisovans, Homo sapiens, and one ghost lineage still known only through its absence in the fossil record, but its quiet trace in our DNA. Scientists did not find this story in bones, but in patterns, mathematical echoes inside genomes. When paleogeneticists compared the DNA of modern humans to that of neanderthals and denisovans, they noticed that the degree of genetic difference between these groups could not have accumulated within the few 100,000 years that fossils alone suggested. It pointed to something older. Statistical models recalibrated the timeline of divergence, pushing it back beyond 1 million years. But when newer data from ancient skulls, like the Junxian fossils, suggested physical separation had already begun by about 700,000 years ago, a convergence appeared between bone and molecule. The branching did not happen like a clean split in a tree. It was messy, overlapping, like rivers diverging and reconnecting before finally finding their own valleys. Somewhere in Eurasia, a population that had once shared features with Homo erectus began evolving heavier skulls and wider faces, traits that would one day characterize Neanderthals. Farther east, others adapted to the highlands and cold steppes that stretched toward Central Asia. The lineage later identified as denisovans. Meanwhile, in Africa, populations remained smaller but genetically more diverse. One of these, through isolation and survival, would eventually lead to Homo sapiens, and among them lingered yet another branch, neither quite ancestral to us nor entirely separate, a ghost population, inferred only through subtle genetic signatures that do not match any known fossils. The idea of four parallel lineages challenges the old image of human evolution as a linear ascent. Instead, it is a web, each strand influenced by geography and climate. Population geneticists call it a reticulate model, a network of evolving groups exchanging genes occasionally, but mostly walking separate evolutionary paths. Around 700,000 years ago, global ice volume peaked again, and the world's habitats reorganized in ways that favored divergence. Europe's emerging Neanderthal ancestors became shaped by cold glacial plains, their bodies growing stockier, their skulls more robust, their nasal cavities broadening to warm, frigid air. In Eastern Asia, where conditions oscillated between forested basins and high-altitude tundra, the Denisovan ancestors adapted differently. Less massive faces, perhaps more generalized physiques, suited for variable environments. In Africa, where conditions fluctuated between wet and dry but rarely froze, our ancestors evolved under a different kind of pressure: mobility, endurance, and social adaptability in fragmented, unpredictable ecosystems. The ghost lineage adds another dimension to this map of possibility. Its existence is not speculative fantasy, but a measurable deviation in genomic trees, a statistical necessity to explain why certain stretches of DNA in both modern humans and archaic genomes do not line up with any known ancestor. Somewhere, a population branched early, leaving faint traces in Denisovan and African genomes, then vanished without fossil record. Perhaps they lived in Central Africa or the Arabian Peninsula, regions still underrepresented in the fossil archive, or perhaps they disappeared entirely, absorbed by the populations that followed. Every genome carries such shadows, genetic relics of vanished peoples whose names we will never know. The key to understanding these four lineages lies in what geneticists call effective population size, the number of individuals actively contributing genes to future generations. After the bottleneck described earlier, populations were small, isolated, and vulnerable to drift. When groups of only a few thousand survive in separate regions, random mutations can quickly become defining features. Over a span of 100,000 years, such isolated populations could diverge deeply, even without complete separation. The result: distinct morphological trends emerging in different regions while still sharing a common ancestor. Modern computational genetics allows us to model these divergences with remarkable precision. Using mutation rates calibrated from both ancient DNA and modern genomic variation, researchers estimate that the Neanderthal and Denisovan lineages likely separated from the ancestors of Homo sapiens between 700 and 800,000 years ago. Within that same window, the Neanderthal-Denisovan lineage itself split, perhaps around 650,000 years ago. Meanwhile, in Africa, the population that would eventually give rise to modern humans continued evolving separately, though still carrying ancient gene flow from earlier lineages. These are not precise dates, but probabilities, each an overlapping shadow of evolutionary time, reconstructed from the faint signal of molecular clocks ticking through deep history. Fossil evidence supports this picture of gradual divergence. The European record shows transitional forms such as those at Cima de los Huesos in Spain, whose features resemble early Neanderthals yet are far older than the fully distinct Neanderthal skeletons that appear later. In Asia, fossils like Yunxian and Jinishan bridge older Homo erectus forms, and the later, more derived Denisovans. Africa's mid-Pleistocene fossils, such as those from Bodo and Kabwe, show a mix of archaic and emerging modern traits: broad faces but expanding brain cases, intermediate between the earlier erectus forms and later sapiens. Taken together, these scattered fragments sketch the shape of a family dividing slowly under pressure, each branch adapting to its own geography and rhythm of survival. This evolutionary splitting was not simply biological, it was ecological. Every branch of humanity inherited the same basic toolkit of cognition and endurance, but faced different landscapes that sculpted those capacities in unique ways. In glaciated Eurasia, selection may have favoured planning and shelter building to survive long winters. In tropical Africa, endurance and social cooperation would have been crucial for persistence across fragmented landscapes. These pressures shaped not just bodies, but behaviours, the seeds of cultural diversity that would later bloom in different directions. Yet at this stage, it was still a world of shared ancestry, not competition. The boundaries between lineages were porous, their differences real but not absolute. The ghost lineage reminds us how incomplete the fossil record remains. Genomic evidence suggests that some early humans interbred with this lost branch as late as 500,000 years ago, meaning they persisted far longer than we might expect. The problem is that geology has hidden much of their evidence. Africa's tropical soils dissolve bone quickly. Asian sediments are vast and underexplored. Even Europe's caves, which preserve well, contain only snapshots of certain regions. The more we search, the more we realise that every fossil we find is a survivor of chance. For each skull unearthed, hundreds of others have eroded, burned, or vanished without trace. Our knowledge of the past is not the whole story, but the faint residue of what time allows us to see. The discovery of 4 main lineages does not contradict the idea that humanity has a single origin. It expands it. The lineage that became us was never a single population in one place, but a dynamic network of groups exchanging genes across continents. The phrase "out of Africa" still holds for our recent ancestors, but deep time tells a subtler story. An evolutionary mosaic stretching across Africa and Eurasia, with roots that may have entangled long before the final separations. What makes this moment in our story extraordinary is not the split itself, but what it reveals about resilience. Evolution did not eliminate 3 of the 4 immediately. For hundreds of thousands of years, all 4 lineages survived in parallel, each testing a different answer to the same question. How does an intelligent primate endure in a changing world? The Neanderthals specialised in cold and cooperation, the denisovans in high-altitude endurance, the African ancestors in adaptability, and the ghost lineage, whatever it was, perhaps occupied a forgotten niche somewhere between. For nearly 500,000 years their stories ran side by side, the biological equivalent of multiple drafts of the same idea. Only one lineage would eventually dominate the narrative, but all contributed chapters. Today, when scientists compare the genomes of these ancient groups, they can reconstruct the shape of their divergence like a musical chord. 4 notes that began in harmony and then drifted apart into dissonance. The distance between them is measurable in base pairs, but the meaning lies beyond mathematics. Each mutation, each small change in DNA, represents a life that survived long enough to pass it on, a lineage that endured one more winter, one more birth, one more fire. So, what if evolution didn't choose one path, but 4? Then perhaps the story of humanity is not about a chosen species, but about persistence itself, the capacity of life to experiment, to fracture, and still continue. We are not the single outcome of a simple plan. We are the last echo of a chorus that began long before names, a lineage shaped by divergence, loss, and improbable continuity. The genome we carry today is not just our inheritance, it is the memory of every branch that once walked beside us and the silence of those that didn't. Imagine a Europe locked in cold light. The rivers are heavy with silt, the forests thin, the air dense with the breath of a coming ice age. Around 640,000 years ago, the continent was entering one of the most demanding evolutionary experiments in human history, the shaping of a body and eventually a mind for cold. From scattered populations that had once walked through temperate grasslands, a lineage began adapting to snow, to scarcity, and to months when the sun barely rose. Over time, these people would become something new. But what emerged from that crucible is not a sudden species. It is the slow architecture of survival, written in bone, face, and genome. In a deep chamber beneath a Spanish hillside called the Sierra de Atapuerca, more than 6,000 fossil fragments would one day be found. The site, known as Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, preserved at least 28 individuals who lived and died around 430,000 years ago. It is one of the most extraordinary windows into mid-Pleistocene Europe, revealing a population halfway between the earlier forms of Homo and the later Neanderthals who would dominate the region. Their skulls tell a story of gradual transformation. Brow ridges thickening like ledges of stone, faces projecting forward to warm the cold air as it entered the nose, bodies broad and dense to conserve heat, and limbs shortening to minimize surface area. This was not evolution by catastrophe, but by endurance, a population tuning itself to the cold in the only way it could, through time. What makes the fossils of Cima de los Huesos remarkable is not just their anatomy, but their clarity. For decades, scientists debated whether they represented an early form of Neanderthal, a distinct species, or something in between. When nuclear DNA was finally extracted from the bones, it placed them unmistakably within the Neanderthal branch of the family tree, evidence that this lineage had already taken form by at least 430,000 years ago. Yet the mitochondrial DNA told a stranger story. Instead of aligning with Neanderthals, it was close to denisovans, the mysterious eastern cousins who would not be recognized until the 21st century. This genetic paradox, Neanderthal nuclear DNA wrapped in denisovan-like mitochondria, suggests that Europe's early humans were not an isolated experiment, but a population still echoing with older mixtures. Somewhere, before these people were sealed in that cave, their ancestors had exchanged genes with another group, leaving a signature that would persist for hundreds of millennia. But to understand Cima de los Huesos, we have to step back into its world, a Europe far different from today's map. Forests spread and retreated with every glacial pulse. Mammoths roamed the open plains. Rivers like the Rhine and Thames flowed through valleys that would later freeze solid. Life here was not defined by geography, but by rhythm, the cycle of freeze and thaw, of expansion and retreat. To survive this constant fluctuation, humans needed flexibility, but isolation made that difficult. Small bands would have been trapped by advancing glaciers, forced southward into pockets of refuge in Iberia, Italy, or the Balkans. There, evolution did its work in miniature, sculpting bodies generation by generation for endurance rather than mobility. The fossils show it clearly. The Cima individuals had cranial capacities rivaling or exceeding modern humans, averaging around 1,200 cubic centimetres, but their skull shapes were different, longer, lower and heavier. Their faces were large, with pronounced mid-facial prognathism that likely helped to warm cold air before it reached the lungs. Their teeth were strong and worn flat, adapted for a diet that mixed meat with tough plant matter. Their bones, dense and powerful, reflect a life of immense physical strain, where every movement demanded energy conservation. This anatomy was not primitive, it was specialised. It was the product of hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation to a Europe that no longer offered comfort. Some researchers see in these fossils the beginnings of the true Neanderthal form, a species defined not by its extinction, but by its remarkable success. For nearly 500,000 years, Neanderthals endured repeated glaciations, mastering cold climates long before Homo sapiens existed. Their story began here, in the mid-Pleistocene, among people who learned to live in a world that froze without warning. They became the ultimate Ice Age specialists, balancing intelligence, strength, and cooperation in ways that mirrored our own future struggles with environmental change. Yet the paradox of their DNA reminds us that isolation was never complete. The presence of denisovan-like mitochondrial sequences implies that Europe's ancestors were once part of a wider network stretching into Western Asia, where gene flow still occurred before the continental ice sheets sealed them off. It may be that this genetic blending introduced adaptations that later defined Neanderthals, perhaps metabolic changes, perhaps immune system refinements. Evolution rarely acts cleanly. It borrows, blends, and repurposes. Every genome is a mosaic of survival strategies tested across landscapes and time. The Cima site itself hints at another mystery. The bones were not scattered randomly, but concentrated in a deep pit at the base of a vertical shaft, accessible only by a narrow passage. There are no clear signs of predator activity or flooding. Some paleoanthropologists have suggested that these bodies were deliberately placed there, an early form of disposal, maybe even ritual. If true, it would represent one of the first known gestures of collective care, a community choosing to return its dead to the earth in a single place. Others argue it was simply a geological trap, a hidden chasm into which generations of explorers fell. Either way, what the site preserves is intimacy, the closeness of a small population surviving together through cold and scarcity. Climate records from ice cores and marine sediments tell us that between 640,000 and 430,000 years ago, Europe oscillated violently between warm interglacials and brutal cold stages. During glacial maxima, much of northern Europe became uninhabitable, and even southern regions experienced harsh droughts and reduced vegetation. Populations contracted into refuges, valleys, coastal plains and river basins where resources could still sustain life. When the ice retreated, these groups expanded northward again, repopulating the continent. Over countless cycles, these expansions and contractions acted like evolutionary filters. Those with bodies and metabolisms suited for endurance survived and passed on their genes. Those less adapted disappeared quietly into the genetic past. To evolve a body for ice is to evolve patience. Adaptation does not happen through a single winter, but through thousands. The Neanderthal form, emerging from these experiments in endurance, reflects the intelligence of persistence. Wide noses to warm air, short limbs to retain heat, broad chests for powerful lungs, dense bones to endure the strain of a cold, high-protein life. Even their skull shapes, once described as primitive, now appear as the culmination of a precise evolutionary solution. It was not crude strength, but environmental design. And yet, the same features that made them masters of glacial Europe also lock them into its rhythm. When climates shifted again, when warmth returned and flexibility became the new advantage, that same specialization would become a constraint. Evolution, like climate, is never done. It trades one advantage for another. But for hundreds of millennia, this cold-adapted lineage thrived, a parallel humanity sculpted by wind and frost. For us, these bones whisper a deeper question about adaptation itself. What does it mean to evolve not toward progress, but toward survival? The people of Cima de los Huesos were not inventing tools or painting caves. Their innovation was biological, the quiet transformation of anatomy into endurance. In a way, they were Europe's first successful experiment in long-term resilience. Today, their DNA survives, not only in the fragments extracted from those bones, but in ours. Around 2% of the Neanderthal genome persists in modern humans outside Africa, influencing immune systems, skin, even responses to cold. That legacy began here, in a Europe that tested the limits of endurance and found ways to persist. If you could stand beside them in that ancient Spanish cave, you might not recognize them as foreign. Their eyes, deep and steady, would reflect the same calculation ours do when facing hardship. How to make it through the next season. They did, again and again, until their form became a testament to patience. Theirs was not a failed experiment, but a long success story that simply ended when the climate changed once too often. The pit of bones still holds their memory. Layered dust, compressed time, and the first shadows of a people who would one day build hearths in frozen valleys and outlast the mammoth. In the stillness of that place, it is not hard to imagine their final descent, whether by chance or by choice, into the deep earth. A quiet return to the ground that had shaped them for so long. What becomes of the branch that disappears but still speaks through our genes? Imagine the eastern half of the old world around 600,000 years ago, a mosaic of plateaus, forests and cold steppe lands stretching from central China to Siberia. Here, a population of humans, neither primitive nor modern, lived in small, scattered groups. They hunted in pine-shadowed valleys, shaped stone and bone, and watched the climate shift between ice and thaw like a slow pulse of the earth itself. These were not yet the denisovans we know from DNA, but their forerunners. the eastern children of that great divergence that split humanity into multiple paths. Their story is quiet, because Asia does not preserve time the way Europe does. Bones rot in its humid soils, and caves collapse under monsoon erosion. What remains of them are fragments: jaws, skull caps, molars, and microscopic isotopic traces that whisper about the world they endured. One of the earliest clues comes from the Yunxian fossils of central China, dated to nearly 1 million years ago, and later reconstructed with modern imaging. These skulls, heavy-boned yet broad-faced, already show a departure from the classic Homo erectus form: a wider cranial vault, a brain approaching the size of ours, and a flattened midface that would echo in later denisovan remains. They stand as a bridge between older Asian hominins and the mysterious lineage that would one day leave its genetic fingerprints in modern humans across the Pacific. By around 600,000 years ago, the eastern landscape was changing. The monsoon belt oscillated wildly. Periods of warmth gave way to deep freezes that emptied rivers and reshaped grasslands into cold savannas. Populations followed water and prey, moving along river corridors like the Yellow and the Yangtze, and across the open plains of what is now northern China. Genetic modelling suggests these people were few, perhaps only thousands, living at the edge of survival, often isolated by mountains and ice. Yet even in small numbers, they persisted for hundreds of millennia, passing down both tools and genes that would later surface in distant descendants. Sites like Zhoukoudian near Beijing, once home to the so-called Peking man, reveal that by 500,000 years ago, early humans in this region were mastering fire and complex tool-making. The charcoal and burnt bones found there speak of long familiarity with flame, not stolen from lightning, but tended and protected across generations. Isotopic studies of tooth enamel from these fossils show omnivorous diets and seasonal flexibility, traits that may have allowed survival through alternating glacial and interglacial phases. What distinguishes these populations is not grandeur, but continuity. While Europe's populations vanished and reappeared with each ice pulse, Asia's eastern lineages endured, smaller, less visible, but genetically steady through the chaos. Then, around 400,000 years ago, a population living somewhere between the Altai Mountains and Central Asia established what we would later call Denisova Cave. Inside that remote chamber, in the shadow of Siberian pines, generations of Denisovan ancestors would leave traces of their presence, not in art or tools at first, but in their bones and DNA. Their fossils are rare: a fragment of finger bone, a tooth, a piece of jaw. Yet from these small remains, entire genomes have been reconstructed, revealing a lineage both ancient and distinct. The Denisovans were not simple eastern Neanderthals. They were a separate branch, long isolated but still connected enough to share faint ancestral links. Their divergence likely began hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and by the time the cold deepened again, they had already become their own experiment in what it meant to be human. Morphologically, what little we know of them fits somewhere between robustness and subtlety. The jawbone discovered in Bishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan plateau, later attributed to the Denisovan lineage, bears massive molars and thickened bone, traits that mirror earlier fossils from China like Dali and Jinyashan. These features suggest continuity across nearly 500,000 years of Asian prehistory, a persistent Eastern morphology distinct from both the Greece-Isle African populations and the heavily built Europeans. The Denisovan form was not accidental. It was the outcome of slow adaptation to the highlands, forests and open steppes of Asia. Their tools, though simple, show local refinement: large cutting flakes and scrapers designed for butchering megafauna, perhaps the same animals whose isotopic traces remain in their teeth. Population genetics allows us to infer what fossils cannot show. The Denisovan population appears to have remained small and regionally divided, with occasional mixing among subgroups spread from Siberia to Southeast Asia. This structure explains the surprising diversity seen in denisovan DNA. Distinct lineages existing side by side, separated by distance and time. Some may have adapted to temperate valleys, others to frozen uplands. Such fragmentation is both a risk and a strength. It limits genetic flow, but it allows local adaptation to thrive. When a lineage endures long enough under such pressures, it becomes not weaker, but more varied. A patchwork of survival strategies written into every chromosome. For much of their existence, these eastern populations lived unseen by their western cousins. While Neanderthals evolved in Europe's glacial refuges, the denisovans occupied a mirror world, mountains instead of valleys, permafrost instead of cave hearths. The distance between them was more than geography. It was ecological. The denisovans' world was one of cold light, sparse resources, and long isolation. Yet this isolation gave them genetic uniqueness. The same distinctiveness that would later leave measurable echoes in humans living thousands of generations later. The idea of an East that remembered is not just poetic. Asia preserved continuity where other continents fractured. The same mountain corridors that trapped these ancient people also protected them from extinction. When global cold peaked during the marine isotope stage 16 event, around 650,000 years ago, many populations elsewhere crashed. In Asia, small groups endured in scattered refuges, river valleys in China, coastal forests in Southeast Asia, and upland basins like the Altai. These refugia became time capsules of humanity's mid-Pleistocene diversity. And as climates warmed again, these survivors re-expanded, carrying with them a complex mixture of old and new traits. The denisovan genome, when finally sequenced hundreds of thousands of years later, revealed this deep structure. It showed not only their closeness to Neanderthals, but also hints of even older ancestry. Traces of contact with other archaic humans, perhaps the descendants of early Homo erectus in Asia. This means that the denisovans were not just a single species, but a composite of lineages that had been evolving side by side for nearly 1 million years. The ancient East was not empty. It was crowded with evolutionary memory. To understand what it means for a branch to disappear but still speak, we have to remember that extinction is rarely absolute. Genes persist where bones do not. The denisovans may have vanished as a visible species by the time Homo sapiens began their migrations, but fragments of their DNA endure in living humans, quiet proof that their story never ended. Evolution's archive is not kept in fossils but in blood. Every base pair that survives across tens of millennia is a sentence written by survival, a record of beings who endured long enough to pass something forward. What makes the denisovan story remarkable is not their disappearance, but their persistence. For hundreds of thousands of years, they lived through the same environmental chaos that sculpted all of humanity. They adapted to freezing winds and thin air, to the rhythm of monsoons and the hunger of winter. Their world was colder, quieter, and lonelier than ours, but their legacy remains imprinted in us, in ways we are only beginning to decode. So what becomes of a branch that disappears but still speaks through our genes? It becomes memory made biological, not legend, not myth, but continuity itself. The denisovans remind us that evolution is not a story of replacement, but of overlap. That sometimes the most enduring voice in our lineage is the one we can no longer hear, except in the rhythm of our cells. Imagine a continent so vast that it could hold 12 different beginnings at once. Around 600,000 years ago, Africa was not the single unified cradle of humankind we once imagined. It was a living mosaic, a land of shifting rain belts, flooded basins, forested highlands, and expanding deserts, each region shaping its own version of what it meant to be human. In those millennia, Our lineage was not a single thread, but a web, multiple populations related yet distinct, diverging and reconnecting in a slow continental conversation that would one day give rise to Homo sapiens. The story of Africa's many beginnings begins with faces carved from stone and bone. In the heart of Ethiopia's rift, at a place called Bodo, a skull was found weathered but intact, its eye sockets deep and its forehead sloping. Dated to roughly 600,000 years ago, it carries a strange duality, archaic and yet familiar. The brain case is large, over 1,200 cubic centimetres, but the brow ridges are heavy, and the face still juts forward in that old primitive architecture. Cut marks along the skull surface hint at some early mortuary behaviour, perhaps defleshing for ritual, perhaps something we no longer understand. Whatever the reason, the Bodo skull marks a lineage still forming, neither Homo erectus nor fully modern, but something in between, something uniquely African. Far to the south, in what was then the wetter highlands of Zambia, another skull would one day emerge from the Broken Hill Mine, later renamed Kabwe. Its discovery in the early 20th century would spark decades of debate. With its massive brow ridge, short face and intermediate cranial volume, the Kabwe fossils seem to combine features from different ages. It was eventually labelled Homo rhodesiensis, though that name has always been more a placeholder than an answer. Dated between 300 and 500,000 years ago, the Kabwe skull may represent one of many regional populations that flourished across Africa, not evolutionary dead ends, but distinct expressions of the same lineage adapting to different climates. Across the continent, variation was the rule, not the exception. Fossils from places like Florisbad in South Africa, Olorgesailie in Kenya, and Dutu in Tanzania reveal a spectrum of forms that defy clean classification. Some show expanding brain cases and reduced prognathism, faces drawing closer to the vertical plane of modern humans. Others retain older, heavier features more typical of the earlier Homo. Rather than a single population evolving steadily toward us, Africa at this time was a network of experiments, groups separated by distance, climate and time, yet still connected by intermittent gene flow whenever the rains returned and savannas reopened. The climate made sure nothing stayed still for long. Between 600,000 and 300,000 years ago, Africa experienced dramatic oscillations in temperature and rainfall as the planet cycled through new, glacial rhythms. Lakes filled and vanished, forest expanded and then withered back to grass. Each shift carved new migration routes and then closed them again. Populations that had once mingled became isolated. Others, long separated, found one another again. Evolution in Africa was not a ladder but a restless dance. Isolation producing variation, and reconnection blending it anew. Paleoanthropologists now suspect that this complex population structure may be the real foundation of Homo sapiens. Instead of a single birthplace, there may have been several semi-independent centres of innovation across the continent, each contributing genetic and behavioural traits that would later converge. In East Africa, increased cranial capacity and more globular skulls began to appear. In southern Africa, dental patterns and facial flattening moved toward modern proportions. In central and western regions, we find evidence of technological refinement, more controlled stone flaking, hefted tools and pigment use. Each region was adding a piece to the puzzle. This distributed model fits what we see in both the fossils and the genetics. Even though DNA from fossils this old is rarely preserved in Africa's heat, modern genetic diversity hints at deep ancestral structure. Multiple populations existing side by side for hundreds of millennia. Some of these lineages were more closely related to each other than others, but none dominated the entire continent. Instead, gene flow moved like seasonal water, strong during humid phases, drying up during arid ones. The result was not homogeneity, but resilience. Diversity itself became a survival strategy. The tools tell a similar story. The Acheulean hand axes that had defined human technology for over 1 million years did not vanish overnight. But around this time, regional styles began to diverge. In East Africa, tools became smaller and more refined. In the south, edges grew sharper, flakes thinner, suggesting improved control and planning. The emergence of prepared core techniques, such as the Levallois method, points to shared cognitive advances occurring independently across regions. These were not accidents. They were the outcome of parallel evolution in minds already capable of abstraction and foresight. Some researchers suggest that Africa at this time was already producing what we might call incipient Homo sapiens. Not yet us, but recognisably approaching the threshold. Faces grew smaller and rounder, skulls more globular, bones slightly lighter. The neurological substrate for complex behaviour, symbolic thought, social structure and language may have been forming under the surface, shaped by the demands of cooperation and adaptation. In a sense, modernity was not an invention of one species but a continent-wide gradient that slowly intensified until it became visible in both form and behaviour. When we speak of ancestral humans, it is easy to imagine a single population evolving neatly toward us, but the evidence refuses that simplicity. The Bodo skull, the Kabwe cranium, the Florispad face, each one represents a local solution to the same evolutionary challenge. Each is a different chapter in a continental experiment. Even the name Homo heidelbergensis, often used as a catch-all for these mid-Pleistocene humans, may conceal more than it clarifies. The African fossils under that label probably belong to multiple distinct populations that interbred intermittently, but never merged into a single lineage until much later. By 300,000 years ago, this fragmented but connected system of populations was approaching a turning point. Morphologically, modern features were appearing in multiple regions almost simultaneously, as if the entire continent had been converging toward a shared outcome. Africa's story was never one of a single birthplace, but of a network of survival zones, ecological laboratories where evolution tested variations of the same design. When the climate stabilized and mobility increased again, these lineages met, mixed and blended their traits into what we now recognize as Homo sapiens. So, can a continent have more than one origin story at once? Africa did. It was less a cradle than a chorus. Many voices, each singing in its own rhythm, occasionally harmonizing into something greater. The fossils of Bodo, Kabwe and others do not mark failed prototypes, but early verses of the same long song we still carry within us. Our species was not born in one place, but everywhere that life could endure across a continent that never stopped changing. What if species didn't know they were different? What would that even mean in a world without names, without borders, without the idea of species itself? Around 500,000 years ago, the Earth was home not to one kind of human, but to several. They looked similar enough to share food, tools and territory. They recognized something familiar in one another's faces, eyes forward, hands calloused, the same upright posture against the wind. When their paths crossed, they probably did not see others. They saw potential allies, rivals, or mates, and so they mixed. Across Africa, Asia, and Europe, genes flowed long before the modern idea of separation existed. For decades, paleoanthropologists tried to draw hard lines around ancient humans, neat categories like Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo antecessor, each imagined as a distinct chapter. But the more we learn from DNA and fossils, the less those borders hold. The Middle Pleistocene, roughly 500 to 300,000 years ago, was not a collection of isolated species, but a network of populations diverging and reconnecting through time. The lines that later became Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Homo sapiens were already forming, but they were not yet exclusive. They overlapped, traded genes, and sometimes merged entirely before splitting again. Geneticists call this introgression, the transfer of genes between diverging populations through occasional mating. It's not rare in nature. It is how evolution often works, especially when populations are small and mobile. For mid-Pleistocene humans, introgression was almost inevitable. The same small bands that moved along rivers and coasts also carried mutations, immunities, and adaptations. When groups met after long isolation, the exchange of DNA was not an event. It was a survival mechanism. We can see traces of this in the genomes of later hominins. Mitochondrial DNA from the Cima de los Huesos fossils in Spain, dated to about 430,000 years ago, show surprising affinities to denisovans rather than to their closer European relatives, the Neanderthals. Yet their nuclear DNA places them firmly on their Neanderthal branch. This strange mismatch is not a contradiction. It's a signature of ancient hybridization. At some earlier point, the ancestors of those Cima individuals interbred with an Asian lineage whose mitochondrial genes spread through the population before eventually being replaced again. In other words, the European branch of humanity was not purely European. Its bloodlines already carried echoes from the East. Similar complexities emerge in Africa, though the evidence comes not from fossil DNA, which rarely survives there, but from population modelling. Genetic studies of modern African variations suggest that some lineages diverged more than 700,000 years ago, and then later rejoined, leaving traces of ghost introgression that cannot be linked to any known species. These patterns imply that ancient African populations repeatedly met, mixed, and separated, maintaining a kind of evolutionary dialogue across time. There was no clean origin or single point of replacement, but continuous recombination across geography and climate. Even fossils hint at this hidden traffic. The Kabwe skull from Zambia, the Bodocranium from Ethiopia, and the Petrolona skull from Greece each show blends of traits that defy easy categorization. They are neither early Homo erectus nor fully modern, but transitional in ways that suggest hybrid populations. Broad faces with massive brow ridges sit above cranial vaults that had already expanded toward modern capacities. Some even show asymmetrical combinations, a primitive jaw paired with a more advanced brain case, or vice versa. Such mosaics are not evidence of confusion. They are the biological fingerprints of contact zones where divergent groups met and merged. Species, after all, is a human word, a taxonomic convenience. In reality, the boundary between species is porous. Biologists define species by reproductive isolation, yet in humans that rule never quite applied. Wherever two populations of Homo overlapped in time and space, they likely interbred. The cost of not doing so was extinction by inbreeding. When your entire world holds only a few thousand individuals scattered across continents, every successful birth matters. Hybridization was not the exception, but the glue that kept the genus Homo evolving. Recent advances in molecular dating support this idea of overlapping ancestries. When scientists compare rates of genetic divergence, they find inconsistencies that only make sense if lineages were repeatedly exchanging genes. For example, the split between the ancestors of modern humans and the Neanderthal Denisovan lineage is estimated at roughly 700,000 years ago. Yet certain regions of the genome in both groups show much more recent similarities, as if gene flow had continued for hundreds of millennia after the initial separation. This means that by the time we can label them as distinct, their boundaries were already blurred again. The same pattern appears in the Denisovan genome itself. Some portions of Denisovan DNA look closer to older Asian Homo erectus-like populations, while others align with Neanderthals or even with ancestral Homo sapiens. This patchwork points to multiple waves of mixing, a genetic mosaic spanning continents. Rather than branching like a clean family tree, human evolution resembles a braided river. streams diverging and then rejoining, each carrying sediment from the last. Such complexity challenges the traditional view of species formation. It also raises a philosophical question. If these groups interbred successfully, were they ever truly separate species at all? Perhaps the term species fails to capture the dynamic, fluid nature of our genus. Evolution in humans was not a series of replacements, but a continuous reshuffling of possibilities, a process of divergence without disconnection. This perspective also reframes how we think about extinction. When a lineage like Homo antecessor or Homo heidelbergensis disappears from the fossil record, it may not have gone extinct in the absolute sense. Its genes could have lived on, absorbed into later populations through hybridization. Extinction, in this context, is less a vanishing and more a transformation, a passing of genetic torchlight from one group to another. Even morphology supports this blending. Fossils found at sites like Jinyushan in China and Cima de los Huesos in Spain show intermediate cranial forms that could only have arisen through long-term gene flow between neighbouring populations. These are not abrupt transitions but smooth gradients, consistent with regional interbreeding. Over vast distances from Europe to Asia to Africa, humanity remained a single flexible system of populations, exchanging genes whenever geography and climate allowed. If we could step back and watch the world between 500 and 300,000 years ago, we would not see a landscape divided by species, but one connected by motion. Bands of humans following herds and rivers, crossing mountain passes and occasionally meeting strangers who looked enough like them to matter. There would be curiosity, conflict, perhaps even cooperation. And through these encounters, evolution itself found new fuel, mixing old traits with new, keeping diversity alive through contact. Mitochondrial evidence tells us that such exchanges could leave long-lasting effects. Because mitochondrial DNA is passed down maternally, it records lineages of mothers across time. When one population with a different mitochondrial signature interbred with another, its maternal line could quickly replace the others within a few generations, if those mothers had more surviving offspring. This explains why populations separated for hundreds of thousands of years can end up sharing mitochondrial haplogroups. It is not a contradiction. It is evolution seen through the eyes of migration and birth. We are only beginning to glimpse how deep this interweaving goes. Ancient DNA studies have shown that introgression events were frequent and bidirectional. Genes flowed from east to west and back again, across Eurasia, through corridors like the Levant and Central Asia. In Africa, genetic simulations suggest repeated pulses of contact between north, east and southern populations, each contributing to the eventual genetic landscape of our species. Every lineage we think of as separate may have been part of one long biological conversation. So if species didn't know they were different, what were they? They were us, in plural form. They were humanity in rehearsal, testing the limits of what the human body and mind could become. They lived and loved and buried their dead before names existed to separate them. And when we speak of their hybridization today, it should not be as anomaly, but as ancestry. The fossils and genomes together tell the same story. Boundaries are illusions we draw after the fact. Evolution's real work happens in the overlap, in the valleys where populations meet, in the children who carry mixed bloodlines, in the genes that remember both origins and outcomes. We like to imagine that the story of humanity was a straight line, but it was a weaving, and we are the fabric. What if I told you that the dead still speak, not in ruins or cave walls, but in the chemistry of your own blood? Every heartbeat, every breath you take in thin air, every immune cell that wakes when a virus enters, all of it carries echoes from people who lived and died hundreds of thousands of years before anyone called themselves human. The genomes of modern populations are not clean inheritances. They are palimpsests, layers written and overwritten by forgotten ancestors. And when we read them closely, we can still hear voices from the vanished lineages that once shared the world with us. The neanderthals, the denisovans, and the still unnamed ones we call the ghosts. For a long time, it was assumed that when our species spread across the planet, we replaced everyone else. The fossil record seemed to tell a story of conquest and succession, a linear rise from archaic to modern. But DNA changed that. It revealed a far more intimate history, not replacement, but absorption. The genetic traces of those older lineages didn't vanish with their bones. They entered us. The same interbreeding that blurred the boundaries between species in the Pleistocene left permanent molecular fingerprints. Every living human today carries small percentages of archaic DNA, different fragments depending on where their ancestors travelled and who they met along the way. In Europe and much of Asia, around 1 to 2% of the genome descends from neanderthals. That may sound trivial, but within those fragments lie genes that still affect how we live and survive. Some influence the way our immune systems recognize pathogens. Ancient defenses honed by populations that endured cold caves and persistent infections long before we did. Others alter the sensitivity of skin to ultraviolet radiation, or the rate at which keratin builds hair and nails. In modern humans, these archaic genes continue to respond to the environment, conferring resistance in some contexts and vulnerability in others. Even conditions like allergies, blood coagulation, and susceptibility to viral infections have been traced to Neanderthal segments that once carried adaptive value in Ice Age Europe. In parts of Asia and Oceania, the genetic signatures of another group persist, the denisovans. Although they left almost no fossils, just a few teeth, a jawbone, and fragments of bone, their DNA remains alive within millions of people today. Nowhere is that inheritance more profound than on the Tibetan Plateau, where a single gene called EPAS1 helps high-altitude populations survive the thin mountain air. It fine-tunes the body's response to low oxygen by preventing excessive red blood cell production, reducing the risk of chronic altitude sickness. That mutation, absent in lowland populations, came from denisovans. In other words, an ancient genome adapted to an unforgiving environment still breathes through the people who live closest to the sky. But these echoes are not confined to Asia or Europe. Within Africa, the deepest root system of our species, the genetic story is even more intricate. Because DNA degrades rapidly in heat, there are few ancient African genomes to read directly. Yet modern African DNA reveals something stranger, signals of admixture with at least one archaic population that has never been found in the fossil record. Researchers call it ghost DNA, a legacy from an unknown lineage that diverged from other humans perhaps 600,000 years ago, and later reconnected with early Homo sapiens. This invisible ancestor still contributes up to 10% of the genome in some modern African groups. Its identity remains a mystery, neither Neanderthal nor Denisovan, but another branch that lived, adapted, and eventually dissolved back into the living. Together, these genetic remnants tell us that Ancestor X, the common forebear of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens, never truly vanished. Its descendants spread across continents, fragmented, adapted, and remerged. But parts of that original genetic architecture remain inside us. When we map our genomes, we are not tracing separate species, but threads of one vast tapestry, woven through deep time. Every divergence left behind not just bones, but molecular footprints. Adaptive tweaks to metabolism, immune response, and physiology, still active in our bodies today. Consider this. If you have ever recovered from a respiratory infection, if you have felt your body adjust to altitude, or if your skin responds differently to sunlight than someone else's, you're living out the results of evolutionary experiments conducted hundreds of millennia ago. We often imagine our ancestors as distant or alien, but their biochemistry remains in service, silently negotiating the same environmental pressures they once faced: oxygen, cold, pathogens, hunger. Our DNA is a time capsule of survival. The presence of these archaic genes also redefines what it means to be human. For years, scientists drew neat boundaries: modern humans here, archaic humans there. But the genome refuses to honour those divisions. It shows us that humanity was never a single lineage but a collective, a network of populations exchanging information through both culture and reproduction. The survival of those genes into the present means that extinction, in a biological sense, is not absolute. Even when a population disappears, its adaptations can persist if they offer an advantage. Extinction is porous, evolution remembers, and yet this inheritance is not only physical, but poetic. When we talk about the echo in our blood, we're also describing the continuity of life's memory, the persistence of problem-solving written into flesh. The denisovan apaz one gene reminds us that adaptation can come from unexpected sources, from neighbours rather than direct ancestors. The Neanderthal immune genes remind us that cooperation and contact often achieve what isolation cannot. The African ghost DNA reminds us that entire civilizations of the body can vanish without leaving bones, yet still live on invisibly through us. What is remarkable is not simply that we carry these genes, but that they still function. Evolution does not keep unnecessary code. The fact that archaic DNA persists in active use, shaping physiology, health, and even cognition, means that the story of those lost humans continues as a biological collaboration. Their existence made ours possible. Their survival strategies became our inheritance. They are not extinct. They are molecularly integrated into the living. Of course, this story is still unfolding. Every new genome sequence reveals additional fragments of archaic inheritance. Some regions of the human genome are so ancient that they predate the emergence of Homo sapiens itself. These segments may have travelled through multiple species, passed like heirlooms through hybrid generations. In the last few years, researchers have even found evidence that some of our immune-related genes may have originated from unknown archaic populations, more ghost ancestors whose fossils we have yet to find. Each new discovery widens the frame of what it means to be human. If we zoom out far enough, the idea of a pure human lineage dissolves entirely. Instead, we see a pattern of adaptation through exchange, a species defined not by isolation, but by connection. Our DNA is not a single story written by natural selection. It is an anthology edited by time, with contributions from every branch of our evolutionary family. In this way, the dead continue to shape the living. They are not memories, but participants in our physiology, in the quiet molecular decisions that keep us alive. Sometimes, late at night, when scientists sequence ancient DNA, they describe the moment of alignment, when fragments from a fossilized bone line up perfectly with sequences from living people. There's something intimate in that recognition, a reminder that we are not separate from those who came before. The data itself feels like a conversation across time. Their base pairs are blood. The distance between a denisovan cave and a modern genome shrinks to a single nucleotide, and for a brief moment, time collapses. So why do the dead still write in our DNA? Because they never truly left the page. Evolution is cumulative, not clean. Every adaptation, every migration, every chance meeting between ancient humans left a signature that continues to resonate through us. We are walking archives, libraries of extinct minds, still running on borrowed code. The ancient ones endure not in their bones, but in our breath, our blood, and our resilience. And maybe that is the quietest miracle of all, that in trying to find where humanity began, we discover it never really ended. The story is not about separation but inheritance. Not the fall of the ancient, but its persistence within the modern. Every heartbeat is an echo of a lineage that refused to vanish. The next time you breathe deeply, remember, that air, that rhythm, that chemistry, all of it has been rehearsed before. What if the one who made us all left no fossil, only a direction? Imagine searching for a face that was never meant to be preserved, a being that existed not to be remembered, but to be continued. Every bone we've found, every genome we've sequenced, every model we've built points towards something, or someone, that never quite comes into focus. Scientists call it Ancestor X, the common origin of us, the neanderthals and the denisovans. But maybe what we call an ancestor was never a single creature at all. Maybe it was a pattern, a network of connected lives, slowly assembling the recipe for what would one day become human. We tend to imagine evolution as a family tree. Clear branches, clean divisions, each species rising from the one before it like rungs on a ladder. But when we look more closely, the structure collapses into something far more chaotic and beautiful. Not a tree, but a web. A web without a single centre, without a starting point we can name. The more fossils we find, the more that picture blurs. The more genomes we decode, the more tangled the story becomes. It turns out that the deeper we dig into our past, the less it behaves like a line, and the more it resembles a pulse, an ongoing rhythm of divergence and reunion, extinction and inheritance. Somewhere between 1.5 million and 500 million years ago, populations of early humans began to drift apart, sculpted by isolation and time. Some adapted to the cold, others to the heat, others to altitude or aridity. Each carried slightly different versions of the same ancient blueprint, but none of them were us. Not yet. The lineage that would give rise to modern humans was never alone, never sealed off in a single valley or continent. It was one voice in a chorus of evolving minds, and that chorus, across Africa, Asia and Europe, was what shaped the human condition. Ancestor X may not have been a person, or even a species. It may have been a conversation happening across time, one that never truly stopped. When researchers build evolutionary trees today, they still draw branching diagrams because we need them. They help us understand order, sequence, descent. But even those scientists will quietly admit that real life doesn't fit neatly inside those lines. Gene flow, the mixing of populations, is constant. Isolation is temporary. Every so-called species is a snapshot of something that was always changing. If you could stand somewhere in the Middle Pleistocene and look around, you wouldn't see separate species staring across an evolutionary gulf. You'd see variations of a single idea, the human experiment unfolding in parallel. Faces not quite like ours, but not unlike them either. Minds learning, remembering, adapting, each a test case in what the universe could do with self-awareness. We keep asking where this began, as if there was a single spark that ignited humanity. But what if the spark was a long, slow burn that never really went out? What if becoming human wasn't an event, but a tendency, an ongoing direction in nature toward complexity, empathy and reflection? In that sense, Ancestor X is not missing. It's everywhere. It's in every shared behaviour across early humans. The careful shaping of stone, the tending of fire, the passing of food, the recognition of kin. These are not traits of one species, but of a shared inheritance, scattered across continents, carried forward by the survivors of each generation. When scientists admit we may never find the fossil of Ancestor X, it isn't a confession of defeat, it's a kind of humility. It means an understanding that evolution does not produce neat artifacts for our narratives. It works in gradients, in slow accumulations, in exchanges invisible to the fossil record. The creature we seek may have left no trace, because it never stood still long enough to fossilize. Its bones became the bones of others, Its genes diffused through populations that rose and fell. It was not a single ancestor, but a convergence of many, and yet we keep looking. We build 3D models of crushed skulls. We sequence fragments of DNA from caves and teeth. We measure tiny differences in brow ridges and jaw angles, trying to infer relationships between beings who never met. Every discovery is another thread, and with each one the web becomes clearer and also more unknowable. The paradox of deep time is that knowledge multiplies mystery. The closer we get to understanding our origins, the more those origins dissolve into complexity. There is a quiet beauty in that uncertainty. To not know exactly who made us is to remain connected to everyone who could have. The missing ancestor reminds us that we are not the final product of evolution, but an ongoing version, still changing, still blending, still becoming. The genome is still in motion. The experiment continues. Perhaps Ancestor X is not behind us, but within us, still unfolding with every generation. Science at its best doesn't promise closure. It offers us something deeper, participation in the act of discovery. The point is not to arrive at the final truth, but to keep asking better questions, to recognize that even an unfinished story can be complete in its wonder. When we speak of the search for the missing ancestor, what we're really describing is the search for belonging, the desire to see ourselves as part of something continuous and ancient. The fact that we cannot find the first human only proves that there was never a single threshold. We crossed it slowly as families, as wanderers, as minds learning to remember. Maybe that's why so many fossil sites feel strangely intimate. A skull, half buried in river silt, a hand axe worn smooth by fingers we'll never know, a hearth's ashes cold for hundreds of millennia. They are not monuments, but footprints, temporary marks left by travellers on a longer road. Ancestor X is the traveller, not the destination, the trace, not the statue. And we in turn are only the next footprints. If you stand quietly and think about it, there's something comforting in the idea that the origin of our species was never a single point. It means that no one group, no one place, owns the beginning. The making of humanity was a collective act, unintentional, distributed, unrecorded. A whisper passed through generations of creatures who never imagined we would one day name them. Every fossil we find is a reply from deep time, answering the question we've been asking since we learned how to ask it. Where do we come from? The answer, in its simplest form, is from everywhere. In that sense, the absence of Ancestor X is not a void. It is the reminder that we were always plural, that evolution works not through isolation but through connection. The boundaries between us and the archaic are blurred not by ignorance but by truth. They were us, and we are still them. The missing ancestor does not hide in rock or bone. It lives in the continuity of life itself, in the fact that, somehow, against all odds, awareness survived. So perhaps the next time we picture our origins, we shouldn't imagine a face emerging from the dark. We should imagine a web of light, spreading in all directions, flickering with memory. Not a family tree, but a constellation. Each star a population, each glimmer a chance meeting that shaped what we are. Ancestor X is not a fossil waiting to be discovered. It's the shape of that constellation, the invisible geometry connecting all points of life. And as we continue to study, to model, to wonder, we might learn that the greatest discovery was never the fossil, but the humility to admit we may never find it. The comfort comes from knowing that we don't need to. The evidence is already within us, in the shared DNA, the shared questions, the shared tendency to look backward at night and imagine beginnings. In the quiet between bones and genes, something else speaks. Not certainty, but belonging. And that is enough. Because maybe our origin was never a place, never a single ancestor or event. Maybe it was, and still is, a pattern, unfolding inside every living human, still writing itself, one generation at a time,